Chapter 1601. Published at 3rd of February 2023 8:24 and 13 seconds AM. Chapter 1601. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1601. Byte displaying the abilities of a domain, displaying speed it shouldn't have, poisonous abilities it shouldn't have, outpacing his mind at the same dimension, and now even displaying the effects of a completely different force entirely. Lionel dove out of the wave, but he was still too slow. While he managed to avoid the Cobra Demon's punch, it was as though it had managed to predict exactly where he was going. It was a stupid choice, maybe the most idiotic choice Lionel had ever made. He had been thrust against one wall and then slapped to the side until he hit another one. With the Cobra Demon now coming straight at him, there was only one way to dodge, and that was to his right. To his left there was a barrier, coming straight at him was the Cobra Demon, and the only open space was right there. But if he could realize this, how could the Cobra Demon not? The demon's tail whipped across Lionel's face. At that moment, Lionel smelled the scent of death closer than he ever had before. There was no instant recovery to rely upon, there was no chance at clearing this zone, and there was no escape. His head snapped back and his spine cracked. His skull fractured, his brain rattling about and tearing under strong G-forces that it wasn't equipped to handle even in the sixth dimension. His jaw, nose, and teeth all cracked at once, leaving his face in an unrecognizable, bloody mess. Lionel entered a dazed-like state, and the fraction of a moment this took seemed to be stretched into infinity. He could practically feel his body shutting down, the reserves of his life force speeding out of his pores and back into the universe that had gifted it all to him. The pain came all at once and so forcefully that he actually didn't feel a thing. It was hard to tell if it was because his spine had entered an unrepairable state or if this was just the numbing that came with such a lingering scent of death. In those moments, Lionel's thinking speed, which had felt like it was running through sludge all this time, finally picked back up. But that only made him more aware of his impending demise. Shit, he couldn't understand how he made such a stupid mistake in battle. But it was even worse that he couldn't even think of an alternative. Meeting the Cobra Demon head-on was impossible, the gap between them was far too large. Every time it attacked him, its strength seemed to increase. But Lionel knew that the truth was that the Cobra Demon hadn't attacked all out from the very beginning. It was just toying with him. And now, it was bored. It simply didn't feel the need to hold back anymore. Lionel was furious. Furious with Thela, furious with the bastards that had forced the Void Palace into such a situation, furious with himself. The one time he didn't overestimate himself, the one time he wanted to obediently accept a loss, take what he could get and go home, the one time he pressed his own desires down and didn't pursue the position of number one, he had actually ended up in such a state. He didn't want to fight this battle, he never wanted to fight this battle. He wanted to protect the life of his mother, of Aina, of his brothers, and he had felt that the only way to do that was to lay down his pride and focus on maximizing his chances at survival. But even when he did this, he had somehow ended up like this. Bang! Time seemed to finally catch up with Lionel's speed of thought, and his body was slapped back to the corner he had tried to roll out from. His head rebounded against the barrier and his fractured skull directly shattered on impact. Lionel slid down the barrier, his eyes half open to reveal nothing but their whites. His limbs went limp and his body ceased movement. His face was nothing more than a rain of mangled flesh and blood, his limbs were twisted into odd angles and he seemed to have not the slightest sign of life left. Like a candle that had been snuffed out beneath a harsh, cold and suffocating wind, he sat dully, his head hanging, his legs spread and his arms limp. The frosty cold of the Cobra Demon latched onto his skin and blood. With nothing to fight back against it, he quickly gained patches of frost here and there, some on his face, some on his limbs, others on his torso, but each of them spreading like a blooming flower. The Cobra Demon gripped Lionel's neck and pulled him upward. An odd crunching sound followed as the shifting of Lionel's weight forced his cracked spine to crack once again. The tongue of the Cobra Demon slithered out, a hint of surprise coloring its snake-like face. It wasn't very interested in Lionel's corpse, at least not originally. But when the scent of Lionel's blood permeated the air, it made it feel quite intoxicated. Saliva dripped down from the Cobra Demon's teeth. What a boon. It hadn't expected such a weakling to have such tasty blood. Maybe if he might gain a small change at evolving to become a chaos demon. The cobra demon's mouth opened wide, its excitement palpable. Its saliva overflowed, but when it hit the ground, it froze into a puddle of ice. And then, the demon chomped down. A sickening crunch resounded. The cobra demon took a bite right out of Lionel's skull, swallowing half of it in a single gulp. It chewed slowly, its body trembling with delight as it savored every bite and swallowed. Once it did, completely beside itself, it roared with excitement, feeling as though every cell in its body had completely come alive. Its eyes turned red with excitement. When it lowered its head to take another bite, its saliva falling even faster, its gaze flashed. There, where Lionel's frontal cortex should be, a glimmer of a gem lay. Lionel's ethereal glabella. Chapter 1602. Published at 3rd of February 2023 8:24 and 13 seconds AM. Chapter 1602. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1602. Overlord. It was large, abnormally large. Of course, despite this, it was still barely about the thickness of 2 thumbs, but such a thing was already beyond what could be said for most humans. Ethereal glabellas didn't grow in size. Even when Lionel was facing off against enormous oceanic creatures, he had a hard time pinpointing exactly where theirs were, and that was despite the fact that the beast crystals of beasts were innately several times larger than the ethereal glabellas of humans. Lionel's, though, was so large and bright that even in the mess of his sliced skull, it stood out. In fact, it seemed a bit different as well. Incredibly thin crimson threads spread out from it. They were hardly perceptible at all. If not for the cobra demon's sharp eyes, it wouldn't have spotted them at all. But they were just a slight shade redder than even Lionel's own blood. The thin crimson threads didn't spread very far, and couldn't even be considered a single centimeter long each. They seemed to both fuse with Lionel's ethereal glabella and act as a separate existence altogether. But from time to time, they would shift and form into shapes and curves that were simply impossible to understand. In that state, they looked less like threads and more like delicate and thin carvings. The cobra demon was enraptured. Much like humankind's love of refining demons, demons also loved to eat and refine humans. But the truest delicacy was most definitely the ethereal glabella. Only chaos demons could form them, as such lower-level demons were only good for their flesh. But absorbing powerful ethereal glabellas, especially for fiend-class demons so close to the chaos realms, was especially good. The cobra demon definitely felt like it had hit the jackpot. Originally, it thought its path of evolution was over after these humans caught it and forced it to be a ringleader for these pathetic little juniors. But with such an opportunity before it, how could it not be ecstatic? If before it wasn't certain, it was sure now that so long as it swallowed and completely refined Lionel, it would finally take that step it had been dreaming of for so long. Its manipulation of force had already reached the greatest extent it could. If it wanted to, before it had been captured by these humans that is, it could have broken into the 7th star whenever it wanted. But it was unwilling to. The 6th star was considered to be the true start of a practitioner's journey. It was the dividing line between those who could truly become powerful and those that would forever wallow in mediocrity. If it entered the 7th star without changing its class, the difficulty of doing so in the future would be exponentially more difficult. It had originally regretted its unwillingness. If it had broken through earlier, it would have been too powerful for the humans to use for this test, so it would have avoided such a fate. And now, it couldn't break through even if it wanted to. But to think that it would gain such a boon. If it broke into the chaos class, the seal placed on it would become useless. It could break into the 7th star in one go and shatter this cage. Once it entered the pinnacle of demon society, it would even have a chance to seek revenge for this day. The cobra demon trembled, reaching forward in an attempt to carefully pluck out Lionel's ethereal glabella. It was best to refine the entire body first. Once that was complete, he would be perfectly primed to refine this gem. But what the cobra demon couldn't have expected was that when it tried to pluck out Lionel's ethereal glabella, something that should have been easy, its claws were rebuffed. It pinched 2 sharp nails together, trying once again, but it was only rebuffed again. If it had a human face, it might have an incredulous sort of expression right this moment. Was it the crimson threads? Lionel was definitely dead. His heart had stopped, his skin had already begun to lose its warmth, and his entire body held not the slightest ounce of tension. It was definitely impossible for him to be doing this, so the only explanation was that these crimson threads and the odd runes they formed were doing something. The Cobra Demon was a genius that had pushed the use of its force to the absolute limit. In fact, it had started off as a human-class demon that diligently worked its way up to its current realm, a feat that took tens of thousands of years. When it came to pure talent, it wasn't nearly the best, as its innate affinity was for a mere water force barely in the top 30. However, when it came to its application and its use, it was on a completely different level. So when it saw itself being rebuffed for the second time, it took a moment to sense exactly what was happening and came to a conclusion. This was a sealing-type force, an extraordinarily strong one. However, this seal was latched onto this body. So long as this body didn't exist anymore, the seal would also fall. It was no doubt a very heavy blood force seal, one more powerful than any it had ever seen before. It was clear that the parents of the cub should be very powerful. They would definitely be enraged about his death. The Cobra Demon knew it would have to escape as quickly as possible, then. Realizing what had to be done, the demon began chomping away at Lionel's body. Every sickening crunch represented another piece that vanished. One arm, both arms. One leg, both legs. The demon didn't dare to eat around Lionel's skull anymore, not until it refined enough of Lionel's body that the seal would lack the blood force necessary to lash out. To the demon's astonishment, it actually found not one, but two innate nodes in Lionel's body, one of which was a legendary 9th star innate node, and the other of which was a 5th star innate node. This alone was shocking enough, but the force that was inside shook it to its core. How? How could it have such great luck? The demon held both innate nodes in its hands. When it completely refined Lionel and evolved, it would have the perfect foundation to take these innate nodes as its own. While Miguel wasn't able to perfectly assimilate with it due to the Luxnix family's crude methods, it would be able to use Lionel as a catalyst for its perfect fusion with these two innate nodes. Like this, it wouldn't just become a normal chaos demon, in the future. It would become an overlord. Chapter 1603. Published at 3rd of February 2023 8:24 and 13 seconds AM. Chapter 1603. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1603. To Ash. The Cobra Demon's neck flared open and closed, its excitement clear in its crystalline blue eyes. Although fire force was maybe the force that it was the least compatible with, this should ironically help with its breakthrough. The penultimate realm one could reach in their force, a step that the Cobra had yet to reach itself, was to birth one's opposite upon reaching an extreme, while the ultimate realm was to revert back once more. These were concepts that Lionel had no idea about, and they were things that the demon had only learned itself after countless thousands of years. The demon felt that it was still several steps away from this penultimate level, but if it could suddenly grasp the exact opposite of its own force to such a high level and even be able to meditate on these complete star runes, it would finally make a breakthrough. With such a breakthrough, even if it didn't become a chaos-class demon and even if it stayed in the 6th star, it would still become several folds more powerful, maybe even dozens of folds. The demon clutched the two innate nodes, looking toward what remained of Lionel's corpse with a hint of fondness that seemed completely out of place. One would have thought that it was looking at its own child rather than a meal that was half completed. When it made it settle its emotions and regained its calm, it continued to eat. Up Lionel's torso, savoring the tenderness of his lungs and sweetness of his heart. The demon had never had a human that tasted so good. Most of its life, it could only cannibalize its own kind. But demon flesh was very hard to eat, which was why humans refined it. Too much was lost in the process. But human bodies, even ones as tough as Lionel's, were so soft and tender by comparison, and that was especially since a corpse couldn't possibly activate bronze runes. They were an exceptional delicacy and one that demonkind couldn't get enough of. When the demon had finished eating through Lionel's neck, jaw and much of his face, leaving nothing much more than what remained of his brain, it couldn't help but sigh. It wanted to eat more, to savor more. Unfortunately, there was only one Lionel here. No, that wasn't true. Once it refined this and became a chaos demon, it would be powerful enough to target those truly monstrous humans and strengthen itself. And since it would have been an evolved chaos demon, it wouldn't be stuck behind the seal either, so there would be little to nothing the humans could do about it. It would be too powerful. In truth, the only chaos demons running around this world now were the very few that had escaped the fate of being sealed, and the ones like this fiend-class demon that evolved on their own after the event of all those years ago. Of course. The humans had no idea about this. While they were fighting full-blown wars against the demon bubbles, the great families, the supposed defenders of humanity, were hardly fighting any battles at all. It was all a great joke. They consolidated their power based on what they had supposedly done and were currently doing for humans, when the reality was that they did nothing at all but live lives of luxury. Of course, this wasn't entirely the case. There were still some chaos demons they had to keep in check, and they dealt with most demons like it ahead of time before they could evolve. It definitely wasn't a coincidence that it of all demons had been captured like this. It was a method of getting rid of future problems. But for the most part, the great families rested on their laurels. And now that they finally faced a problem they felt they might not easily be able to deal with, rather than doing their job as the protectors of humanity, the job they were paid so handsomely for, whether via tributes, respect, or power, they instead chose to hold such an event instead. They planned to wrangle together some useful talents they could use as cannon fodder so that they'd once again be able to survive while putting in a minimum amount of effort. Humans were truly pathetic. The Cobra demon sneered. Clearly it had a great amount of intelligence to piece all of this together. But how much of it was true and how much of it was just its distaste and bias against those that had hunted it down for its whole life, that much was unknown. The Cobra demon carefully ate around what was left of Lionel's brain. Piece by piece, it swallowed them down. Just as it had expected, the movements of the small crimson threads became slow and they even became dimmer. By the time there was nothing at all left of Lionel but his ethereal glabella, the crimson threads had no movement left whatsoever, falling into a dormant state and even losing their crimson color, becoming a lifeless black. The demon caressed the small ethereal glabella. As it sat in meditation, its stomach churned and its body quickly refined Lionel piece by piece. A relentless wave of power flooded through it again and again in tall tsunamis. Its cells and its blue scales shone with a vibrant color. And then, for the first time in over 10,000 years, its scales actually began to shed. Every shed cycle the Cobra demon went through, the strength of its body would actually more than double. It couldn't believe that such a weak human had given it such an evolution before it even entered the Chaos Demon realms. The more perfect its fiend-class body, the stronger its Chaos-class body would be. This couldn't have come at a better time. The Cobra's tongue flickered in and out, its sapphire eyes glowing like two blazing torches. And then, it swallowed Lionel's ethereal glabella, entering an absolutely focused state. Its body couldn't be more primed and ready right at this moment. Boom! The aura of the demon began to skyrocket, its power advancing by leaps and bounds as it rushed toward the Chaos Demon realms. Its body bulged and shrank in a continuous cycle, its muscle fibers doubling and its organs shining with a resplendent light. What the demon didn't know, though, was that its actions of pushing Lionel through the gates of death and finally and truly awakened the latter's soul, a state that only the spirituals could experience, a race of people that built their own bodies. Within the demon's stomach, Lionel's ethereal glabella flashed. Life steal. Instant recovery. The demon, who had been sitting on the edge of ecstasy, suddenly froze. A strong pulling force latched onto its circulatory system, ripping at its blood and swallowing it by the tens of liters. The demon's recovery abilities made up this blood in an instant, but the suction only increased. At first it thought that this was part of its evolution, but it was then that it realized that it could no longer feel its connection with Lionel's ethereal glabella. In fact, the two innate nodes that it had set aside to fuse with later, suddenly shot into the air, rushing toward it and stabbing two holes in its stomach. The demon roared with fury, realizing that there was definitely a problem. It had always been quick on its feet and extremely intelligent. If not for this, it would have never made it so far and been so persistent. Without hesitation, it pierced a claw into its belly, ripping its stomach sac out and throwing it a long distance from itself. The demon's scales became somewhat pale and its aura plummeted, but even still, it only fell from the quasi-7th star to tier 3 of the 6th star. However, it wasn't paying attention to this at all, its blue eyes having become red with fury as it watched a blob of flesh quickly reform amidst a pillar of gold light. Even its stomach sac was absorbed and used to reform the naked body of a familiar young man. Lionel fell about a foot from the air, his face pale and his limbs still trembling. He had felt every second of himself being eaten alive. It was a feeling that made his body vibrate from head to toe. He gripped his fists, his lips far more blue than red and his hair far more white than violet. Even his dimension had dropped from the 6th back down to the 5th. He raised his head, meeting the gaze of the Cobra Demon. At that moment, the Cobra Demon, who was furious in its own right, trembled. The fury in Lionel's eyes drowned out its own. Fueled by humiliation, Lionel's rage seemed to want to burn the world to ash. Chapter 1604. Published at 3rd of February 2023 8:24 and 14 seconds AM. Chapter 1604. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1604. Spiritual Lionel's body felt like it was breaking apart. It felt like he was a normal mortal man once again and that he hadn't eaten or had anything to drink in weeks. Not only was his skin pale, his heartbeat was incredibly fast as it tried to move around the limited blood in his body, and his skin practically stuck to his bone. He had gone from someone who had more defined muscles and vascularity in a lean frame than most bodybuilders had in their behemoth-like bodies, to a walking, breathing skeleton. Though, even breathing hurt, so the latter might not even be true for very much longer. The furious light in his eyes was almost like the smoldering flames of an undead, his sunken features making him look like he was a step away from death. The state of the Cobra Demon couldn't be considered to be much better. Lionel had left it in a terrible state. Even after taking so much of its blood, he had barely had enough to reform his body. It was clear that the gap in talent between Lionel and the fiend-class demon was actually enormous. If not for this, how could the latter drop down 6 tiers, and yet Lionel could still hardly stand. In fact, he hadn't even been able to maintain his 6th-dimensional status. The Cobra Demon should have been able to heal an injury as simple as a lost stomach almost instantly. And yet it still stood hunched over in the distance, its eyes and tongue flickering as it kept its gaze locked onto Lionel. It was clear that it could seem to heal. However, lingering energies from its near breakthrough into the Chaos Demon realms was still there. It just needed time to recover, and there was about a 10% chance it could still manage to make that final breakthrough. However, when facing the smoldering fury in Lionel's eyes, its senses were primed to an extreme, its scales rippling as they moved up and down. It couldn't even think about a breakthrough right now. It had never seen someone capable of regenerating to such an extent. Even demons, who were especially known for their recovery abilities, couldn't do such a thing. Could it be that this boy had that soul separation ability it had heard about? But no, that still shouldn't be possible. Those with that ability needed to take over other bodies. They didn't even have ethereal glabellas, as their souls were vessels capable of replacing the function of one. As such, their very essence could be moved from place to place. It was possible to create a body for oneself if you had such an ability, but as a human, your ability to do so would be very much lacking in comparison to spirituals. This was because a spiritual could take raw materials and use their powerful souls to mold it into their image. However, one with this ability wouldn't necessarily have a soul powerful enough to do this. In addition, even if they did, they would lack the refinement techniques of the spirituals. As such, you would only be able to use crude clone creation methods like Era. But such clones would only last a few years at best before you would have to create a new one. Could it be that this boy was a spiritual? One that had used the raw materials of its very own body in order to reform his? When the Cobra Demon thought to this point, its body shuddered and its level of seriousness raised by several levels. It wasn't a fool. Lionel didn't have the aura or smell of a spiritual. However, when it thought about the fact that Lionel had 2 innate nodes of the number 1 fire force in all of existence, it overrode all of its other thoughts. Theoretically, if a spiritual wanted to, they could construct a body with a human aura. In fact, now that the Cobra Demon thought about this, wasn't this a human lead trial for youths? Could it be that this genius of the spirituals had masked his real identity in order to sneak in and partake in the secrets of the demons? The spirituals should be far more powerful than humans, though. Was it even necessary to do such a thing for someone of Lionel's caliber? However, the Cobra Demon didn't bother to think so far. Every race had its own internal conflict. For a spiritual like this boy to have such poor force control and comprehension, it definitely meant that he had been ostracized by his people. A genius of this level should be able to wipe it out with a single wave of a palm, but clearly this boy could not. Plus, if it treated Lionel like a spiritual genius, it wouldn't lose out. In fact, its caution would only help it. Until now, it had only been toying with the boy, not bringing out even a small fraction of its strength. But now, it would go all out. The temperature plummeted and then plummeted once again. The pit in the demon's torso became a block of ice, freezing over all the leaking blood and stopping it in its tracks. The Cobra Demon reached out into seemingly empty space. But at that moment, fine lines of cracks in space appeared and its hand vanished, leaving only its forearm in sight. With it pulled back, a menacing weapon slowly manifested inch by inch. It carried with it the wild fluctuations of space. A scythe that looked as though it had been carved of black ice made its presence known. Everywhere it swept by, space froze over and cracked. It curved with a murderous aura, blue frost wafting from its body. The Cobra Demon rose to its full height, roaring into the skies above. Bang! It shot forward like a streak of blue light. Lionel was the only thing it could see. This boy was the gate between it and freedom, between it and true power. Spiritual or not, it would make sure that this boy felt its pride as a demon. Chapter 1605. Published at 3rd of February 2023 8:24 and 14 seconds AM. Chapter 1605. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1605. Demon Blood. The Cobra Demon appeared before Lionel in the blink of an eye. The smoldering fire within the latter's eyes as sharp as blades. Lionel took a step to the side, dodging out of the way of the blade. He felt like he could finally see again. The slush his mind had been wading through was nowhere in sight. No. It was still there, it was just far less capable of affecting him any longer. He could finally think like himself, finally calculate like himself, finally make the world dance in the palm of his hand like himself. A spear appeared in his hand as the scythe sliced down a mere inch from his nose. He didn't have the strength to manifest his panda construct. His body was too weak to summon his bronze runes. He couldn't summon his stars, the pressure he had put on his mind previously to save Aina was far too much, and it only became worse after his soul separated from his body and lost its support. The only things that hadn't abandoned him was his ability index, his innate nodes, and this spear in his hand. His gaze blazed. This was more than enough. Scarlet star force flooded Lionel's body from his left kidney. At this moment, he was thankful that he hadn't shattered the seals upon it to the 6th-dimensional level. With the current state of his body, there was no way that it could handle 6th-dimensional scarlet star force. Flames blazed to life around him. He had never been more focused. His spear pierced outward, taking claim of the absolute perfect timing. The gaze of the Cobra Demon flickered. It was surprised by Lionel's sudden increase in reflexes. What happened? However, it didn't care. It had already approached with the utmost caution. As for these Scarlet Star Force flames, how could they possibly hurt it with such a crude, rudimentary usage? The scythe of the Cobra Demon flipped in its palms, changing the direction of its blade and slicing toward Lionel's back despite the fact that the demon stood before him. The hook of the blade was fully prepared to cut Lionel at the waist, but the latter didn't even seem to notice in the slightest. Destruction runes flashed in Lionel's smoldering pupils, the blade of his own blade shifting and perfectly colliding with the polearm of the scythe. It looked like a completely useless action, but the small force was enough to carry a bit of extra momentum over to the scythe blade. The demon's original strike had been a downward swing, so now it was actually pulling its scythe upward to deal Lionel a blow. Lionel's sudden and unpredictable actions caused the demon to overshoot, the hook of its scythe just barely grazing the tips of his hair. The demon faltered in its step backward, not having received the resistance it had expected from slicing through Lionel's waist. Due to its caution, it had actually expected Lionel to be able to block this attack, somehow, some way, but what it hadn't expected was for destruction runes to flash in Lionel's eyes for a mere parrying maneuver. Lionel was already moving forward. His spear spun in his hand, a wheel of flames forming as he used a technique he hadn't in a very long time, Infernal Cyclone. All he could do now was use these simple techniques he had gained from Valiant Heart Mountain, but in his eyes, they would be more than enough. He regretted it. He regretted ignoring his heart and not shooting for first place, for scrounging for what he could instead of ripping away what he wanted. A wheel of fire shot forward. Powered by Lionel's Scarlet Star Force, it tore the ground apart, rushing forward like the wheels of a blazing race car as it closed the small distance between Lionel and the stumbling Cobra Demon in an instant. Lionel's spear spun once again, forming another wheel and closing the distance. Due to its miscalculation, the Cobra Demon's scythe wasn't in place to block or counter. It could only remove a hand from its polearm and slammed out with a claw. Meteoric impact. Lionel didn't miss a single beat. Even as the wheels of fire shattered into a rain, he took a strong step forward and he pierced through the fires with a deathly momentum. His spear appeared before the Cobra Demon, but shocking enough, it wasn't toward any one of its vital points like the demon had expected, but rather right into the block of ice that had blocked up its stomach. The Cobra Demon was smart enough to consider that Lionel might use the first attacks as a cover. Lionel had already done it once, it was very possible that he'd do it again. But it thought that Lionel would attack one of its vital points, not a block of ice. Although it was an injury, it wasn't life-threatening. As a fiend-class demon, even if it didn't heal it, it would easily survive for decades without its stomach. It just didn't make sense for Lionel to attack such a thing. The tip of Lionel's spear barely pierced the ice, however this was where the effects of meteoric impact activated. Bang! An implosion of fire blasted from the inside out. The Cobra Demon's eyes widened, coughing up a mouthful of blood as it was blasted backward. Lionel's battle intent blazed as a tempest of flames rose up around him. Harmonic spear. His voice was frighteningly cold. At that moment, hundreds of flame clones, each wielding a fiery spear, appeared in the skies. The plummeting temperature began to skyrocket. Even if Lionel couldn't win by quality, he would win by quantity. He still couldn't understand how this Cobra Demon was so powerful, even using spatial abilities when it clearly didn't have such an affinity, but none of that mattered. All he wanted right now was for his blade to taste blood. Demon blood. His clones all pierced out at once. Chapter 1606. Published at 3rd of February 2023 8:24 and 14 seconds AM. Chapter 1606. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1606. Chaos Demon. The Cobra Demon's body rebounded against the barrier even as Lionel's clones all pierced forward at once. It coughed violently again and again. Lionel's spear was hardly strong enough to pierce its block of ice, which went to show just how sturdy it was. However, this was precisely its downfall. Lionel had used its own force against it, using it as materials for his makeshift grenade. Right now, shards of the Cobra Demon's own ice had torn into its lungs, its intestines, and most unfortunately, its heart. With how slow its regenerative abilities were now, such a thing was a death sentence unless it could find something to nourish itself. But would Lionel allow it such an opportunity? It felt that the moment Lionel had reformed his body, it had entered quicksand it couldn't find its way out of. It found that its suppression of Lionel, at least toward the latter's mind, was of no use at all. And now that Lionel's mind was unleashed in full force, it couldn't keep up with his deductions, and it couldn't read Lionel's intentions any longer. The Cobra Demon faced this rain of fire with a look of unwillingness in its eyes. How far had it climbed to reach this point? Now it was just a single step from its goal, a single step away from becoming the chaos-class monster it had always wanted to be. but now it was going to be snatched from it at the finish line? No. 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 The neck of the cobra demon flared, its mouth opening wide. It pushed itself up, a wild mist of frost billowing around it. Die. 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 Lionel's clones shattered one after another, the dissipation of one leading to a large impact on the cobra demon's wild flurry of force. However, Lionel's expression only remained as cold as ever. When it came to stamina, none could match up to an innate node holder, never mind the state the demon was in. This demon was only hastening its death. Lionel's spear spun, releasing infernal clone after infernal cyclone. Bright red gold wheels shot through the dull ground, grinding the cobra demon down step by step. His spear pierced outward. If he could also use vanishing blade, he could have already ended this battle. But it was impossible for him to manipulate space in his current state, especially not with the crude methods of a technique of Valiant Heart Mountain. Bang! 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 Roar! The cobra demon ignored everything, not even protecting itself as it started a mad charge toward Lionel. Although it had seemed that it could casually deal with Scarlet's star force, that was all. The cobra demon controlled a mere top 30 water force at the 6th dimension while Lionel controlled the number 1 fire force at the 5th dimension. The former was able to use its expert control and understanding of its force to make the latter seem useless, but as it ran out of stamina, it became harder and harder. So it ignored everything, conserving what was left of its stamina to charge through Lionel's wall of fire. By the time it came out of the other side, it was nothing but a blazing humanoid, its scales, body and flesh quickly charring under in the inferno. It swiped at Lionel with its scythe. However, Lionel only flicked out with his spear. Crack! In its madness, the cobra demon had forgotten what its scythe was formed out of. Now that it had abandoned all forms of protection, how could the scythe continue to maintain its structural integrity? The shards of ice sparkled as they fell through the air. Time seemed slow, the rain of ice twinkling beneath the raging red-gold flames as Lionel's spear continued its forward sweep, piercing right through the demon's heart. With its scales quickly being destroyed, how could its defenses still be the same? The cobra demon fell to its knees before Lionel, blazing in a pillar of fire. Its head raised, laughing into the skies. All that effort, tens of thousands of years, countless battles, all to fall here. However, at the very least, this vile human wouldn't gain its body. It would rather burn to ash right here in a final blaze of glory. Just as it was about to fall, though, Lionel reached through the flames and grabbed its neck, squeezing down hard. He looked down at the cobra demon, meeting its gaze through the raging fires. Did I say that you could die as you pleased? Your corpse is too valuable. Don't you like to eat people? I'll make sure to savor you well. The flames that the cobra demon found to be impossible to deal with any longer suddenly vanished into wisps of smoke as though they had never been there, leaving behind a half-dead, charred demon. As the final embers of its life flickered out, the cobra demon couldn't pull its gaze away from Lionel's. Just, which of them was the demon, exactly? Standing there, as sickly as could be, with barely the strength to even stand, Lionel still somehow felt like a monster it shouldn't have dared to stand against. At that moment, outside the battlegrounds of Top 10 versus Demon, the sound of shrieking resounded through the demon world. By this point, 9 of the top 10 had already exited, leaving Lionel as the only one left. 2 of these top 3 had joined up with Thela as they were members of the Endless Twilight Pavilion. However, right this moment, all 3 were in a bloody mess. Their clothes were shredded to pieces, their tender bodies an unrecognizable, bloodied mess, and all of their lofty arrogance had shrunk to nearly nothing. Demon! Thela shrieked. You're not a blood sovereign, you're a demon. Demon! Demon! She seemed to have completely lost her mind, unable to even speak in coherent sentences. Before her, a beauty of unspeakable proportions stood. The white of this beauty's eyes had turned completely black, her irises looking like a pool of blood. On her back, at the level of her hips, a pair of black wings grew out where her venous dimples would have been. Above her head, there was a jet-black halo, and out from her tailbone, there was an incredibly thin and sharp tail that grew out like a menacing whip. A twin pair of horns curved out from her forehead, sparking with black lightning from time to time. Her body was wrapped in floating black feathers that circulated around her, making it difficult to tell if she was wearing clothes at all. The hints of skin such an appearance revealed was enough to intoxicate all those who saw her, including even women. It was you. You drove him to such a state. You deserve a life worse than death, a woman by Thila's side crushed a talisman. This was already her 10th time doing so, but she kept trying again and again. Master. Master. Chaos demons have infiltrated the fiend class sect. Just then, the tail of the chaos demon whipped outward and a pink tongue flashed into the air, spinning about before plopping to the ground. This chaos demon swept a sorrowful gaze forward that quickly became frighteningly cold, as though she was thinking of other methods to torture these three. This chaos demon was none other than Aina Brazinger. Chapter 1607. Published at 6th of February 2023, 7:46 and 15 seconds AM. Chapter 1607. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1607. LSLTU. Lionel fell out of the air, landing on the ground with a stumble. His lungs felt like they were filled with sand at this point. If it wasn't because he had a decent amount of strength in his healthy form, he wouldn't have nearly enough energy left in this state to drag around a fiend-class demon. Lionel's gaze turned in a certain direction. Over there, a huge pillar of baleful lights swirling in crimson and black, swirling like a cyclone. The aura was more powerful than anything he had experienced before in this demon world, so much so that even in this state, he could feel it. It had to be understood that right now, Lionel's couldn't even use his internal sight properly, at least not to his normal exaggerated ranges. When he fought the Cobra demon, he had focused all the Dream Force stamina he had left in his ability index so that he would be able to calculate a path to victory, and that he did. But right now, since he didn't need to fuel his ability index to its very peak, he was able to use his internal sight to a small extent. But even then, it was just barely in a 100-meter radius. If others heard Lionel calling 100 meters a small radius for his internal sight, they would be greatly shocked. But truthfully, wasn't a 100 meters small compared to the over 100 kilometers Lionel was usually capable of? Even his starry spirit domain had a range 100 times that, and it was on a level all to its own. That pillar was at least 20 kilometers away from Lionel, though, and yet he could still sense it so clearly. He hadn't even initially been facing that way and could have easily missed it considering his languid state, but it was as though it demanded his attention. Lionel's brow furrowed. This aura wasn't one he recognized, but the coercion laced through it was something he had only ever felt from Aina. When Aina first rid herself of her curse, she had gained a coercion ability that she found difficult to control. Just by existing, her charm could practically enslave the minds of others. When she spoke, her words carried a beauty all to their own. The mental pressure she placed on most was simply on another level. Even Lionel was somewhat affected. Of course, this was also because Lionel had very deep feelings for Aina to begin with. Normally, such coercion wouldn't work on him at all. Lionel didn't know exactly what happened between his and Aina's separation, and their meeting once more. But by then, she had gained perfect control over her coercion and it never leaked again. In fact, she didn't even use it in battle. The last time she used it at all was under Lionel's request to sing a note to test something, resulting in them creating a powerful combination attack, an attack, without which, they wouldn't have been able to kill the first lower fiend-class demon they met in this world. It was thanks to defeating this demon that they gained a small foothold in this world to begin with. However, even after this, Aina seemed quite reluctant to use it. That said, Lionel never blamed her because he understood her feelings quite intimately. That experience Aina had on terrain was a heavy scar on her heart. She almost lost her life to the puppet master, and that was one thing that she could accept, but what the puppet master had wanted to do to her made her freeze up. The one dream Aina had outside of revenge for her mother was to have a large family, for her to bask in warmth she had never gotten a chance to experience as a child and live a happy life. Although Aina had originally wanted to keep a distance from Lionel when the metamorphosis descended, this wasn't because she hadn't had such hopes buried within her heart, but rather because she wanted to protect Lionel, a sentiment that waned somewhat the more of his talent he displayed, but never quite fully vanished. It could be said that of all of Aina's hopes, this was the one that ranked second of them all, but it was also the one that acted as the guiding light of her heart. While revenge might have been number one, there was only so much of such darkness a person could take. Why else would Aina want to have so many children? She really hadn't been joking that day. As many children as Lionel was willing to give her, was as many as she would birth. She wanted a family so large that she would never have to experience coldness again. And yet, that bright, beautiful hope within her heart, within her soul, was taken, twisted, darkened and perverted by the puppet master. Back then, it had really seemed like there would be nothing she could do. Her body was out of her control and she could only sit, shivering. However, due to a stroke of luck, she had been able to use the effect of her curse to escape. But then the bastard appeared again on Earth all while she was in one of her happiest moments with Lionel. The puppet master once again snatched control of her body away. Back then, Lionel hadn't understood Aina's thoughts and emotions so deeply, but he had understood enough to be infuriated. He didn't need to know the details. The fact that someone had made his Aina feel such a way was enough for him to sentence them to death. So, he dropped a city from the skies. Lionel had done everything he could, but since that day, Aina had been very hesitant to use her abilities as a blood sovereign, only feeling comfortable enough to when matters were related to Lionel. She had always hated them because of that lack of control she had experienced that day. Is it you? Despite only just thinking this, Lionel was already running in that direction. His lungs threatened to stop expanding no matter how hard he breathed, but he just kept running. No matter how weak he was now, 20 kilometers was still a small distance to him, and yet it took almost half an hour before he laid eyes on her. The moment he did, his body gave way. Chapter 1608. Published at 6th of February 2023 7:46 and 16 seconds AM. Chapter 1608. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1608. Someone Lionel's consciousness came in and out of focus. He was truly drained. Even his usually endless dream force was tapped out. The process of fully separating his soul from his body was definitely incredibly taxing, and it felt even much like something that shouldn't have happened at all. However, when that was stacked atop of what he had experienced before, it really pushed him over the edge. He had only managed to run so far out of sheer will, and he wasn't even 100% certain if what he expected to find on the other side would be that. However, before he could hit the ground, he found himself enveloped by a soft embrace. The moment Lionel appeared, Aina had sensed it immediately and rushed over. She seemed to blink away from her location, nothing but a tornado of black feathers being left as a marker for her former appearance. When she appeared once more, she had already caught Lionel. Those black feathers that had wrapped around her, dancing about in a pattern around her, was a defense the three women had become intimately familiar with. It was as though they couldn't pass through it no matter how hard they tried. However, at that moment, they didn't harm Lionel in the slightest, allowing his head to pass through as though they weren't there at all. Aina's expression flickered. Lionel looked so sickly and weak. The first emotion she felt with excitement, but then when she said his state she felt worry, and very soon that became an unbridled rage. Die! In her fury, her tail whipped out and shot through the skulls of the three women in one sweeping motion that was no less sharp than a flexible sword. As though a disc had run through their foreheads, their expressions froze in horror before their bodies plopped to the ground with a dull, wet sound. Aina held Lionel in her arms and shivered when she realized that he had actually fallen to the fifth dimension. Just what had happened to him? Her gaze landed on the demon he had been dragging behind him. Was it because of this demon? Her demonic eyes flickered with rage. She couldn't refine this demon to help Lionel. In his current state, there was no way that he could handle a force pill on this level. One had to remember just the kind of violent upheaval Lionel's body underwent whenever he swallowed these pills. Even in his peak state, it was like he swallowed a mountain and his digestive system was placed under a great amount of stress. Most importantly, it was mostly because of his Tier 4 control ability index that he was able to lower much of the risk. However, if he swallowed even a lower fiend class force pill in this state, he would end up ripping a hole through his body. It definitely wasn't an easy feat to improve your foundation. It needed one to have decent enough talent to begin with and a tremendous amount of focus. Lionel needed something more delicate to absorb. Ana's brows furrowed, but this didn't last too long. She placed a hand on Lionel's chest and a strong life force began to pulse. She reached out another hand toward the demon's corpse and it was quickly sucked dry before it began to be quickly refined. Ana's expression flickered. This demon looked like any other higher fiend class demon, but there was something different about its insides. It was actually on the verge of becoming a chaos class demon and it had even started the process, but for some reason it had halted. After thinking to this point, Ana thrust away all other distracting thoughts. By now, her skill in manipulating blood force had skyrocketed. Since Lionel could absorb it on his own, she would just have to break it down into bite-sized pieces he could absorb. It was as simple as that. Even the Aurora Black Panther's life-steal abilities were nothing compared to her. Lionel quickly began to regain some color. His skin gained some luster, no longer sticking to his bone. His white hair and eyes began to slowly regain their pale violet hues and the faint light they usually emitted. And his muscles returned inch by inch as though vegetation that had finally been watered. Lionel's consciousness, which had been fading in and out, regained some of its focus, his heart skipping a beat. Though it seemed like he had only lost consciousness just now, it was far worse than that. If not for someone's action, he would have died. His body was running on empty and it could be said that the only thing still running was his soul, but once he ran out of dream force, wouldn't it also be running on empty? If his body and soul hit a wall, what was there left if not death? Both needed to be functioning properly for Lionel to hold on to his life. Normal humans of the human domain had their souls and bodies fused into one, so once the body died, the soul would die as well. Likewise, if one met a spiritual capable of targeting one's soul, death would also be the only path forward. However, the separation of Lionel's soul and body meant that he had some leeway. His body could be pushed to the brink of death and he would be able to bring it back with his soul. At the same time, his soul could be brought to the brink of death and he could use his body to bring it back. The only caveat was that his ethereal glabella had to remain intact. It was the link that chained the both. Without it, there was only death waiting for him. Wait, someone? Lionel started and his head shot up to final a demonic pair of eyes looking back at him. Its whites were completely black and the irises were entirely crimson. Ana, who hadn't been ready for Lionel to suddenly wake up, panicked, trying to hide her face. Chapter 1609. Published at 6th of February 2023 7:46 and 16 seconds AM. Chapter 1609. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1609 became. Lionel blinked. He looked Ana up and down, his gaze not giving much of his thoughts away. Horns? Black halo? Wings at waist level? A tail? Black feather tornado in place of clothes? Big, really big, soft breasts. Wait, those had already been there before. Lionel's gaze sparkled. First a vampire girlfriend, now a succubus girlfriend? Raj would be jealous enough to jump off the nearest cliff. Lionel laughed so hard that his voice boomed across the skies, much of his power seemingly having returned to his body. He almost immediately began to play with Ana's wings and tail, just to make sure they were real and that he wasn't dreaming. How had he hit such a jackpot? As for Ana's embarrassment, he couldn't even be bothered with it. Funny enough, the first time Lionel learned that Ana could absorb the blood of others, she had reacted like this as well, scared of how he would take it. Clearly, she hadn't learned her lesson. Lionel had two loves in life: cool uniforms and monster girls. He could already envision Raja's furious howl at the unfairness of it all. Ana squirmed, moving her hands from her face. Her wings and tail were exceptionally powerful in battle, but when Lionel touched them like that it made her feel odd sorts of stimulation she had never experienced before. Quickly, she retracted it all, running away from Lionel's touch. At that moment, the black feathers rotating around her and hiding much of her decency shrank and latched onto her skin, becoming a gorgeous black full-body armor that glided down the grace of her curves. If one looked closely, it almost looked as though she had forged this full-body flexible armor out of the scales of a mighty black dragon. Seeing Aina's tail, wings and horn all disappear at once, Lionel practically pouted. "There should be laws against this kind of thing," he mumbled. Aina was truly speechless when she heard this, but she couldn't help but break out into a smile. As expected, the one who always made her feel the most comfortable in her skin was Lionel. Whether her face was scared, whether she could drink blood, whether she quite literally became a demon, he didn't even seem to care, nor did he ask how any of it had happened. He just continued to have that same childish grin on his face. If not for the crossroads they had reached those years ago, just how deep would their relationship be right now? She simply couldn't see herself with any other man. "Stop playing around, I haven't finished healing you yet." Aina had barely managed to awaken Lionel. Even now, he was still quite sickly and had only regained enough energy to be somewhat lively, but not enough to return to his peak. "Yes, ma'am." Lionel obediently placed his head on Aina's lap as though this was some sort of punishment. Aina began the procedure once more, slowly nurturing Lionel step by step. "Aren't you going to ask?" Aina asked after a while. "Ask about what?" Lionel blinked. Aina rolled her eyes. Sometimes this man was truly too dense. "Oh. You mean about the succubus mommy, I mean demon morphing thing?" Lionel coughed. It just slipped out, truly. They weren't even his words, nor did he have such a fetish. It was just something that Raj had repeated so many times he had subconsciously blurted them out. He was in a delirious half-dead state, he deserved this kind of free pass. Aina burst into another fit laughter. "I didn't know you had such hidden fetishes. I was actually planning to learn the whip as my next weapon, are you interested?" Lionel was speechless for a moment before we recovered. "I think between the both of us, we know who the real masochist is." Aina suddenly blushed profusely. She had never told Lionel that, did he just figure it out on his own? Of course, in the past, Lionel's mind hadn't been sharp enough to pick up on it. But with his impeccable memory and his strengthened mind, he could easily see through things he hadn't been able to see through before. In this arena, he was undefeated. However, what Aina didn't realize was that when Lionel said masochist, he was actually referring to Aina's training methods. But when she suddenly blushed like that, a spark went off in his dreamscape that he couldn't ignore. "Huh?" Lionel's brows shot up. Lionel was about to say something, but he found a firm hand had been placed over his mouth and a murderous glint in Aina's eye as she looked down at him. In the end, Lionel could only cough lightly and pretend as though he hadn't seen a single thing. But inwardly, he was grinning like a madman. "It's the Silver Empire." "HM?" Lionel looked up to meet Aina's again. She had gone back to focusing on helping him heal, but she still began to talk. "When I was with my dad, I entered a zone with the youths of the Three-Pillar Sector. That was a remnant zone of the dead Silver Empire. It was incredibly dangerous and very distorted, and we almost died. However, inside, I was able to receive a legacy that I didn't really fully understand. When I was meditating on the Blood Sovereign Gold Tablet, though, I finally made a breakthrough and I understood something. The things that had confused me about the original legacy finally made sense and it all clicked. When I took the legacy out to confirm, I realized that I was underground and you weren't there anymore. But when I broke out from the earth to try and find you, the legacy began to frenziedly absorb the anarchic force in this demon world and it resonated with something within me. I hadn't expected it to happen, because according to the legacy, it was exceptionally tyrannical and should have been difficult to grasp even with my comprehension. But something triggered that made it all happen automatically. Before I could understand what happened, my body had completely changed and the first genius I ran into here ran away screaming, that I'd become a chaos demon. Lionel fell into silence. The Silver Empire? Chapter 1610. Published at 6th of February 2023 7:46 and 16 seconds AM. Chapter 16:10. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 16:10. Silver Empire. Lionel kept hearing the name of this empire come up again and again. But oddly enough, the Void Palace hadn't had much information on it. One would think that one of the most powerful empires of the human domain would be well documented. After all, wasn't the point of the Void Palace to act as an alliance of humans? But if what Aina was saying was true, maybe it was the case that the Silver Empire was destroyed because of their connection to demons. This wasn't impossible considering the situation in this zone and how the two races seemed to be like fire and water. This would also explain why Lionel didn't understand anything about this zone despite the fact he believed it might be mythological. If the history of the Silver Empire was mostly erased outside of some vague information passed by word of mouth from time to time, then it was highly likely that any fairy tale this world was based on could have been erased as well, if for nothing other than to hide the connection. But there was a very glaring issue with all of this. If the Silver Empire could form chaos demons, Lionel didn't believe for a single second that the powers of the human domain could ever destroy them. Just from these last few weeks of interacting with fiend-class demons, Lionel realized just how large the gap was. If Lionel had to rank himself, he was probably somewhere between a middle and higher fiend-class demon in talent and strength, and he could use his mind and tricks to bridge the gap. Simply put, if the Silver Empire had been formed of a bunch of Lionels, how could the human domain have possibly destroyed them? Of course, Lionel thought of the possibility that they had actually been destroyed by another race, but he threw that idea out immediately. If another race infiltrated the human domain deeply enough to destroy the Silver Empire, why would the human domain even still exist at all? And even if Lionel was willing to accept that their only target was the Silver Empire and they left everyone else alone, that wouldn't explain why much of the Silver Empire's history had been wiped. The only thing that made sense was that the humans themselves wiped out the Silver Empire. But even that was lacking because the strength Lionel had seen humans display until now shouldn't be enough. In that case, it was likely a complex cobweb of internal strife and external pressure that led to their collapse. Things were rarely, if ever, just one-dimensional in their complexity, especially when the topic was real-world politics, powers, and organizations. There was also one more possibility that Lionel hadn't fully considered as well. Let's say that the Silver Empire really was able to access the strength of demons in all their glory and they also had little to no internal strife, or at the very least, not enough to cause them to collapse. How, then, would they have fallen to humans? It's very much possible that the core difference here isn't in being a demon, but rather force manipulation. Lionel's gaze flashed, a possibility coming to him. Why was it that he struggled so much against the Cobra demon? Of course that demon was very physically strong, but what really set it apart was its magnificent use of force. It took a fairly ordinary force and turned it into an insurmountable mountain Lionel couldn't even climb. Thankfully, dying had been the catalyst for Lionel's soul to separate from his body, resulting in his mind gaining a boost that made him immune to the demon suppression of it. But that was ultimately the largest issue by far. From what Lionel had seen, though, the human domain didn't have such force manipulation abilities at all. Could it be, then, that the demons of the Silver Empire hadn't been as towering and undefeatable as the demons in this zone? If that was the case, things would make a little bit more sense and the humans might have been able to destroy the Silver Empire given enough willingness to sacrifice. There was a very easy method of telling, though. Lionel didn't really have to guess. How powerful are you now? Lionel asked. Considering Aina had killed those three, including Thela who Lionel couldn't do anything against, her strength should be very great. Don't overestimate me too much, Aina laughed lightly. I might have killed those three, but the truth is that there was a huge battle royale that broke out before you returned. Oh. Yes. A lot of the top 10 came out in quick succession, the gap between them was very small. So, obviously, those that lost out wanted to fight for the chance they lost out on. There was a huge battle in the center of the world and they all ended up heavily injured. Half of those injuries on them weren't even caused by me to begin with. They caught sight of me afterward when the fighting was finished. They thought the gap was large enough that they didn't have to worry about their injuries, but luckily they were wrong. Right now, I probably just caught up to you again. I didn't have enough time to meditate on the gold tablet anymore, but there should be a lot of room to improve. I've noticed that this world has a very unique method of using force that I still can't quite understand, do you? Lionel fell into silence hearing this question. First, Aina's words confirmed that she, and likely the Silver Empire, were unable to pull out the greatest strength of their demon bodies. That leaves a path for the humans to kill them. But secondly, it seemed that she had noticed what he had as well. I've been thinking about that too, and I think I probably have an answer, but it's really complicated. I'm not quite sure how to take the first step. But if I were to explain it as simply as possible. Why are weapon forces the only ones that can evolve? It's likely that all forces have an evolution path. Chapter 1611. Published at 6th of February 2023 7:46 and 16 seconds AM. Chapter 1611. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1611. Force manipulation. Aina's eyes lit up, but she didn't interrupt Lionel. But I also don't think it's that simple. There's a fundamental difference between weapon forces and other forces, and that's that weapon forces all start from the foundational dimension. Aina frowned. Didn't all forces do that? Lionel's Scarlet Star Force was the perfect example. If not, he wouldn't have to undo the seals step by step. If it was someone else, Aina would have probably interrupted, but Lionel wasn't someone who would make such a rudimentary mistake, so she just continued to listen. When you look at other forces, it feels like that happens as well, but it feels like a rubber band. Lionel chose this example after a while. The stronger the force, the tighter and thicker the rubber. It's harder to stretch, but it's also more resilient at greatest length. It also stores up more energy per length stretched. If you take a normal fire force and you compare it to Scarlet Star Force, the latter is the far thicker and more powerful rubber band, even right from the start. If you stretch it a single inch, and let's say that inch represents the third dimension, if I release it, which rubber band will fly further and have greater impact is obvious. But the starting point, from the very beginning, is different. For some forces, if you stretch it past a certain point, rather than producing more powerful effects, the rubber band will snap. There are just certain levels of power it won't be able to reach no matter what. That's the most ultimate truth. Take my dark ice force, for example. It's a fifth-dimensional force. Aina's brows jumped up when she heard that. She hadn't even thought about it before, but the moment Lionel mentioned dark ice force, things suddenly started falling into place. That was right. Some forces were considered to be of certain dimensions. And yet, higher dimensional individuals used them all the time. What did that mean? As a fifth-dimensional force, that should be its maximum output. I can't really apply more strength to it. However, I fuse my dark ice divine armor with an evolution ore, allowing it to display power comparable to the sixth dimension. Ironically, because of that, it's taken me longer than usual to realize the problem. My dark ice force is quasi-sixth dimensional thanks to evolution ore, my ethereal star force is seventh dimensional, my scarlet star force is ninth dimensional. I haven't reached the end of any one of those rubber bands yet, not even close for some, so I've never noticed the drop-off in power before, or even had to find a way to strengthen the rubber bands. Weapon forces are different, though. You notice the end of the rubber band almost immediately. You're forced to find a path ahead for it, because if you don't, it quickly becomes useless. Level by level, you're forced to push forward. I've honestly wondered why it is that everyone in the human domain uses a weapon force of some kind. Not everyone is destined to use a weapon, there have to be other paths. But the moment I step into this zone with such high-level attainments in force manipulation, I ran into the first and only mage I've ever run into outside of the Camelot zone. Of course, this mage Lionel was referring to was Aina's senior and a member of the Endless Twilight Pavilion. But I think I understand now. In our world, weapons are the only way to push past this bottleneck for people who aren't born with obscenely powerful affinities. Most won't have an innate node like mine, or even an affinity a step or two below. Even the very best lineage factors of the human domain are only seventh dimensional. My metal synergy lineage factor has an eighth dimensional door, but when I asked the dictionary about it, it triggered a video from my dad, and this is apparently a secret I have to keep no matter what. If you're in a world where the 7th dimension is almost a cap, then even in the Void Palace, the top-level geniuses usually, at best, control 6th-dimensional forces. When you combine that with the fact that humans haven't consolidated their talents and focused on 1 or 2 lineage factors across the board, it makes us even weaker. I don't think it's a coincidence that the strongest families in the human domain are the Morales and Seward families, who both have powerful weapon force lineage factors. That's where their advantage lies from the very beginning. Even the Archers' alliance would be right there if not for what happened with the White Lion Bao. It's not because weapon forces are more powerful, it's because weapon forces are the only ones with an easy and logical progression toward the next step. In addition, there's a large number of masters one can pull inspiration from as well, whereas for other forces, it's not so streamlined at all. This should also be another reason why humans are so weak compared to the other races, and if I'm correct, this is indeed a mythological zone, but rather than displaying the use of a normal magic system, this one is a layer deeper than normal, displaying, instead, a universal method of manipulating and using forces of all kinds. I don't think the two of us are any less talented than chaos demons. What we lack are 2 things: foundation and force manipulation. The first can be fixed by absorbing refined demons. The latter, though, is more complicated. If this is a ubiquitous method of this zone, should have already run into methods in the previous exchange stores I visited, but I didn't. I also didn't find anything in the Olidark family's libraries either. It's likely that just like what I faced in the Camelot zone, there's only one method to get the true magic system of this zone. But since we've already failed this zone, that opportunity is gone. So there's only one option left. Aina looked down at Lionel, who was still on her lap. We have to figure it out ourselves. Lionel nodded. He wasn't feeling too terrible about this. Wasn't this what he was already doing with his spear force? He had seen enough examples by now to start figuring this out slowly. Lionel rose to his feet, feeling like he was brimming with power. Let's go to the highest level store before they boot us out of this world. Then we can leave this zone for good. Wait, Aina said for a moment before going to Thila's corpse. Without flinching, Aina shot a hand through Thila's chest and pulled out a bloody lump before handing it to Lionel. Lionel's brows shot up. In his hand, an emulation spatial force innate node Saturday. Chapter 1612. Published at 6th of February 2023 7:46 and 16 seconds AM. Chapter 1612. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1612. Absolute necessity. Lionel's heart skipped a beat when he saw what it was, but he also smiled bitterly inwardly. He hadn't even caught the faintest inkling that Thila had an innate node. This meant that against him, she couldn't even be bothered to use it. It seemed that even though it seemed as though she had been going all out, her pride since caused her to hold back somewhat, yet it was this very same Thila that was only ranked 13th and even ended up losing when she ganged up on the others with her 2 seniors. It was quite difficult to accept, even if this was a zone based on a fairy tale like Lionel speculated. In the end, Lionel sighed. Fusing with innate nodes is too much of a crapshoot. Even after decades, Miguel couldn't even use a fraction of mine properly. I doubt this innate node will be very helpful to me, Lionel said lightly. Still, it suits you far better than it does me. Anyone who tries to fuse with a Dream Force innate node like that one without the affinity would be asking to suffer. Lionel nodded lightly. That much was true. The only reason Miguel had even been able to make some use of his innate node was because he had high light and star force affinity to begin with, and he had the help of the bronze tablet to further help him and improve said light affinity. In addition, Miguel's ability index allowed him to devour and improve his affinities. So with innate light and star force affinity, he just needed to focus on improving his fire force affinity. By then, it wasn't impossible for him to make good use of Lionel's innate node. In fact, now that Lionel thought about it, Miguel's use of his Scarlet Star Force was actually still far beyond his own. According to what he knew, Miguel had spent a very long time at the peak of the 5th dimension. Since he had no other methods to improve, he focused everything on improving his lineage factor and studying his innate node. The result of that was quite magical. Even in the fifth dimension, he was able to kill the patriarch of the Viola who had been nearing the peak of the sixth dimension with a single strike. This was something even the current Lionel wasn't entirely certain he could accomplish. Back then, Miguel hadn't even circulated Scarlet Star Force, he simply sent out a sword strike. In fact, it wasn't even in his strongest state. Back then, he had used his flexible sword, but his strongest weapon was a heavy sword. In addition, he hadn't revealed his white stone elephant lineage factor either. And yet, he was able to display so much strength. It was clear that Miguel's years of meditation on Lionel's innate node had yielded some excellent benefits. If not for Lionel taking his innate node and severing his path forward, it was hard to tell just how powerful Miguel would be now. Lionel sighed. He actually felt quite bad about that looking back. Back then, he was still furious about a number of things, so although he did see Miguel's perspective, he still didn't care to cater to it too much. It could be said that his mind was still in quite some disarray. No, I still am too immature. Lionel looked up into the skies, clutching the innate node. Lionel? Are you okay? Aina seemed to notice that something was off. Lionel looked toward Aina, his eyes softening and a sudden overwhelming feeling overcoming him. He reached out and grabbed her waist, pressing his lips to hers. Aina was taken aback, but still melted into Lionel's embrace. Maybe only the two of them could be so carefree amidst a litter of corpses, flesh and blood around them. When Lionel pulled back, Aina seemed to be out of breath, her gaze misty as she looked up at him. Her heart bloomed with happiness, feeling as though she was walking on air. Let's leave this place, Lionel said lightly. Aina nodded. But quite frankly, it seemed that she would have nodded just the same even if Lionel's words had asked her to walk into the fiery pits of hell with him. Although they didn't exchange such words, it was clear that both of them had the resolve to follow the other to the ends of the earth. Lionel waved a hand and claimed Thila's spatial ring, finding a vial of blood within it. After a small procedure, he finally finished what he needed to and a portal appeared, transporting both himself and Aina away with a single step. Since the process was so elaborate to begin with, they didn't need to exchange any points at all. When their eyes cleared, the two found themselves in a room of white marble. White marble floors, ceiling, walls, and counters. There didn't seem to be anything in this space, but it only took a single sweep for Lionel to find several complex and hidden force arts. It seemed that this place worked similarly to how the odd space he had first met Uncle Montez in. If he wanted something, he would have to ask for it. Lionel's eyes narrowed, this made things more complicated. It would be easy to miss out on things like this, that would be unfortunate. He had already birthed a certain phobia of missing out on things ever since he stepped into the dimensional verse. However, with this thought in mind, Lionel's gaze only sharpened. With his mind working even faster, he wanted to see if there was really anything he would miss out on. He had enough points to rank in the top 10, and Aina had just killed 3 top 13 individuals. Between the two of them, they had more points than even first place by quite a large margin. There shouldn't be anything they wouldn't be able to exchange for. First, let's start with the absolute necessity. After that, we'll go through all the things we need one by one, and if we run out of demon points, we'll order them priority and only by the top of the list first. Lionel nodded to himself and spoke. Show me all of your 7th star spatial force ores with extremely stable chemical structures and sturdiness. Chapter 1613. Published at 6th of February 2023 7:46 and 16 seconds AM. Chapter 1613. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1613. First on the list. Lionel smiled when he saw the selections. The prices were better than he thought. Even the most expensive was a shade under $1 billion or so. Since his and Aina's wealth amounted to nearly 2 trillion, this could be considered chump change. Excellent. Lionel didn't need to pick the most powerful here, he just needed the one most compatible with his current materials. After picking out an ore that went by the name of Starlight Spatial Ward, a domain type or which was known for its defensive spatial abilities, Lionel nodded to himself. With this secured, their escape from this zone was guaranteed. It would all depend on him, but he didn't even consider for a single moment that he would fail. His calculations should be correct. Aina. HM. Because we have to ask for the things we want to appear, it'll be easy to miss out on things if we aren't careful. And we also have a limited number of funds. Though the ore was inexpensive comparatively speaking, I doubt that things will remain like this. So let's test things one by one and make a list. Once we run out of ideas, we can order things based on priority and buy the things we really need first. Okay, I agree. Aina nodded. What do you need? Aina's gaze flickered. I have my hands full with the Blood Sovereign tablet. The methods and techniques within it are almost too numerous and I need to start from the very basics and work my way up. I have a feeling that the secrets of force manipulation you were talking about would be revealed step by step so long as impatient too, so I'm not very interested in techniques, or at least not supplemental techniques or ones that provide auxiliary boosts to power. If I were to choose techniques, they would be for my battle axe. Everything else is covered in the Blood Sovereign tablet. Also my body has a ridiculous amount of potential right now after it underwent that evolution. I even feel that my Abyssal Panther bloodline was purged. I can't sense it anymore, so I don't feel like I need fiend-class force pills either. What about your mental coercion? Lionel asked. That. Aina hesitated. I believe the Blood Sovereign tablet talks about it as well. In fact, half of the tablet is related to that. I see. Lionel nodded. It really did seem that Aina had all of her bases covered. And although she mentioned battle axe techniques, she didn't seem very interested in them either. Aina didn't seem to like to be restrained by techniques and her fighting style was incredibly free-flowing. Lionel fell into his thoughts. It seemed that it would be difficult to find things that it would make sense to give Aina. In the past, he wanted her to take more advantage of her bloodline absorption abilities, but now that she had gained the body of a chaos demon, even that was no longer necessary. An innate node, maybe? Lionel suddenly asked. Aina raised an eyebrow. Is that even possible? Lionel laughed. Why not try? Show us your innate nodes. Lionel didn't actually expect much, but his breathing hitched in the next second. Just what kind of zone was this? Before him, an array of innate nodes appeared. While none of them were on the level of his Scarlet Star Force innate node, there was no doubt that each one would cause a war in the human domain. Innate nodes were so incredibly rare, how could they just casually appear here in such numbers? Soon, Lionel calmed. Things still weren't so exaggerated. There were a little under 24 of them, and even the best of them was only of 6-dimensional forces. Still, Lionel couldn't help but be shocked, especially since they were only about 10 billion demon points each. None of these were worth trading for Aina and none were worthy of her level of talent, but this sudden change really shifted Lionel's perspective. This world, it could accomplish things he could even properly fathom. If it could manifest so many innate nodes for him to choose from, then just what kind of things could he exchange for here? This would absolutely change everything. It suddenly struck Lionel. If there were so many innate nodes here, then maybe. Show me your innate node incorporation methods. Lionel waited, staring daggers at the counters of marble, and just as expected, the lights began to flash one by one. They really do exist. Lionel whispered, turning his gaze to Aina. The two looked toward one another and smiled. It seemed that there were truly higher-level methods of fusing with innate nodes that existed. This meant that Thila's innate node wouldn't have to go to waste. In addition, if Lionel ran into any enemies with innate nodes in the future, he would be able to pass them along to his brothers and friends. The prices of these methods made Lionel's heart ache somewhat, though. While he didn't have to pick the most expensive of the others, when it came to techniques, the more expensive, the higher quality it was. In this case, the most expensive one here was just over 100 billion. That was already a 20th of Lionel and Aina's wealth if they traded for it. Lionel shook his head and added it to a mental list. In all likelihood, he would definitely have to buy such a thing. Thila's innate node was truly too compatible with him, but if he casually fused with it like Miguel had with his own, then it would end up becoming a hindrance instead of a help. It had to be remembered that while Miguel had been a step away from the sixth dimension for so long, the innate node within him was still fourth dimensional. This showed the problem with a poor fusion method. Alright, this can definitely be added to this list. What else? Lionel's gaze turned serious. Why don't you look for things that can help your tentacle womb and the golden-scaled koi fish to evolve? They're still too limited by their current strength. Hearing Aina's words, Lionel's gaze lit up. Chapter 1614. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:18 and 5 seconds AM. Chapter 1614. Gap. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Indeed. The abilities of the tentacle womb and the golden-scaled koi fish were astounding, but the limitations were too great. In order to garner real benefits from them, it would take decades, maybe even centuries of effort. If Lionel had the behemoth of the Morales family behind him, it would be easy to invest that kind of time. But if he wanted such a thing, he would first need to earn it, which would ironically require the help of the tentacle womb and golden-scaled koi fish to begin with. While Lionel was quite confident in his own power, the talent of the Morales family heirs wasn't to be looked down upon. Lionel felt that he should probably be able to contend with sector-ranked disciples now, but not all sector-ranked disciples were created equal, especially not sector-ranked disciples that were from the Morales family of all families. There was a reason the Morales family was considered to be maybe the strongest family of the human domain. To share both their lineage factors in one body was a testament to the fact you wielded great talent, and yet that was just the prerequisite to fight for the right to be an heir. In truth, had Lionel not improved his own strength so much, the gap might have been too large to even think of crossing. Now that he had, though, he finally stood a great chance. Even so, this was just the perspective of individual power. When it came to factions and backing, Lionel was even further behind than that. The majority of Lionel's brothers hadn't even been able to enter the Void Palace. His maternal family was a mere sixth-dimensional family, and the faction that he was still trying to build up with the Oryx and the Umbra family was still in an extremely fledgling state. The Oryx hadn't even really chosen to follow him yet, and he could only be considered to have the backing of one of their princes. And the Umbra family was far weaker than even the Luxniks, at least on the surface. It had to be remembered that the Umbra family was one that had broken away from the Three-Finger cult, and they had the first stage of the dark half of Lionel's lineage factor, the Shadowtail lineage factor. The power they had should mostly be hidden since they had managed to run from the Three-Finger cult, but this also meant that making use of them was a double-edged sword. To make matters worse, Lionel knew too little about how his cousins were faring. What was the depth of their strength? What trump cards did they hold? He didn't even really understand them. All he knew was that his first cousin, First Nova, had done him a favor by influencing the Void Senate. This meant that he had connections far loftier than Lionel could imagine. Then there was Fourth Nova, who had tied Aina to that contract. It seemed that Lionel had easily foiled him, but despite the fact Fourth Nova had had a year to make another move and did nothing, it made Lionel wonder if his true goal was really to poach away Aina at all. Lionel was right to worry about such things. There was still Second Nova, who had a ridiculously wide reconnaissance network that had managed to find out that Third Nova was scheming against the unfettered Blade Party to deal with the stalwart Polearm Party. And yet Lionel hadn't even detected Second Nova even once, nor did any of them know what Third Nova had been planning that day when he forced Lionel's batch into the Rapak's nest. Each one seemed more mysterious than the last, and even if Lionel felt confident in at least defeating some of them in one-on-one combat, what good was that in an air war that tested one in all aspects? Not to mention the fact that even he wouldn't say that he could defeat them all. Then there was still Fifth and Sixth Nova on top of that. The Void Palace had very few records on the Morales family's air wars, at least not in any real detail. However, the things they had described made it clear that the name war was not chosen lightly. When the Morales air wars began, it would sweep up the whole human domain. Just take the Valiant Heart Mountain organization as an example. An organization so far away, and so many galaxies separated from the Morales family, had actually participated as well. When things were looked at like this, Lionel was so far behind that it was hard to put in just a few words. So when he heard what Aina said, he nodded immediately. "Show me what you have to improve beasts." Lionel already had the silver tablet, so he had a shortcut to evolving the two of them. But he didn't allow this to cloud his judgment. He wanted to first understand what methods this world had so that he didn't bias the suggestions too much. But in choosing to do things this way, Lionel quickly realized that he had actually made his ask far too broad. There were too many things and most of them didn't even have what he needed. Taking his time, Lionel asked question after question, narrowing down the lists before him and making adjustments based on what appeared. Eventually, he came to a few solutions. The first was that refined demons were a viable option here. Much like refined demon force pills helped him and Aina, they would also be able to help here as well. The second option was the beast crystals of like beasts. This was an excellent option as well, especially when paired with the silver tablet. Usually, absorbing beast crystals only came with a percentage chance of receiving the effects you wanted, but the silver tablet made it guaranteed. This was how Lionel was able to give Gil his crimson lightning. The third option was fascinating as well, and it was the most complex. However, if it worked, its benefits would be the greatest. And that was to allow the tentacle womb and golden-scaled koi fish to form star runes. Chapter 1615. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:18 and 3 seconds AM. Chapter 1615. Formation. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The force manipulation abilities of this world had been at the forefront of Lionel's mind for a long while already, and he knew that if he wanted to reach the level of power he sought after, he would definitely have to grasp such abilities. Somehow, the further depth of comprehension one gained in this world, they seemed to be capable of displaying abilities further outside the realms their forces were usually constrained to. Lionel had a certain hypothesis, and he felt that it might be correct. Maybe the reason why it was possible to cross dimensional barriers to do battle at all was because his world hadn't grasped these abilities as they should. From the very beginning, Lionel had understood that dimensions weren't simple power levels. They were a qualitative change of being. A fourth-dimensional existence should be able to crush a third-dimensional existence no matter how talented the latter was. That was what science said. However, the likes of Lionel and Aina always seemed capable of breaking these rules. Lionel didn't really understand why this was until something clicked. Why was it that even when his mind was in the seventh dimension, everyone saw him as a sixth-dimensional existence? What about in the past when both his mind and body had entered the fourth dimension, and yet everyone still thought he was in the third dimension? Why was it that only when his internal force entered a new dimension, would he be seen as being at that level? When you asked this question, then you thought about Lionel's hypothesis, and then you connected that with the force manipulation abilities of this zone. Things began to slowly sink into place one by one. Force was the most important factor in one's strength, and the degree to which you could use it was what truly dictated what state of dimension you had reached. Regardless of how strong Lionel's mind or his body, all of the force he used was still firmly in the sixth dimension. Author's note: I think I forgot to write that Lionel recovered to the sixth dimension after absorbing the Cobra Demon, so just assume that happened. Forgive me, but when Lionel fought Thela and his mind worked slower than it should, or when he fought the Cobra Demon and his Scarlet Star force felt even weaker than normal third-dimensional fires, why was that? Well, if you thought about it, was that what true suppression between the dimensions should feel like? Wasn't that the despairing gap that should have always been there, and yet never had been? If it wasn't for the fact that Lionel was in the same dimension as Thela and the Cobra Demon, that despairing gap would have been even wider. It was only thanks to the fact that Lionel's soul separated from his body and thus the suppression the Cobra Demon could levy toward him that he was able to surpass such shackles. If he hadn't, he would have died. Well, he had died, actually. Upon realizing this, how could Lionel's thoughts not be constantly ruled by force manipulation and how to make use of it? And with Lionel's speed of thought, how could he not come up with countless potential hypotheses related to it? One of these hypotheses that he liked the most was that the secret to this force manipulation was tied to what this world valued the most: star runes. Lionel felt that his use and comprehension of star runes until this point was quite artificial, and it hadn't provided him as much of a boost to his prowess as he thought it should. He had formed up to perfect 7th-dimensional star runes on his Dream Force stars, and yet his mind had still been suppressed by the likes of Phila and the Cobra Demon, who had far weaker minds than his own. This made sense. Did he also have star runes in his innate node? In fact, he had 9th-dimensional star runes in one of them, but could he use them? Not at all. At best, Lionel could use his star runes to call down Scarlet Star Force and Dream Force of equivalent dimension, something that his stars were already capable of doing. Clearly, he was missing something extremely important. As such, he felt that there was a 91% probability that star runes held the secret that he was looking for. This confirms something I was thinking about, Lionel suddenly said. What's that? Lionel quickly explained his thoughts before continuing. The mantras should be a shortcut to understanding these secrets. Even though we can't get the full reward of this zone any longer, I think that if we stack up on these mantras, it'll only be a matter of time before we grasp the truth. Even with Lionel's Dream Force talent, he still needed the Dream Force mantra to form his star runes so quickly. If these mantras were able to focus the mind and aid in meditation to such an extent, it was likely that they were the key to connecting with star runes on a deeper, more meaningful level as well. Lionel already had the Dream Force mantra, and it only cost a few million demon points. Stacking up on a ton of mantras shouldn't be too expensive and should be quite easy. He could even get one of every kind so that when he passed down Dimensional Cleanse to everyone, they would be able to grasp these subtleties as well. It was just unfortunate that not everyone would be able to form 9 stars like he had, but he just had to take things one step at a time. Is it possible to teach to beasts, though? Aina asked. She hadn't forgotten that this was the main reason Lionel had gone down this rabbit hole. Yes, Lionel nodded. This force art right here, the Dream Star Gathering Beast Formation, should do the trick. It costs just under 100 billion demon points as well, but it allows me to set up a formation that places both myself and a target beast into a dreamlike state. Through that state, I can pass on the mantra or even cultivate it for them. Chapter 1616. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:18 and 1 a.m. Chapter 1616. Sovereign, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 100 billion? That's quite steep. Can't you do the same thing with your connection with them? Aina asked. Every beast and master had a connection between them. This formation just seemed like an unnecessary step. In addition, they already likely had to allocate a 100 billion to the innate node fusion method, so they had to be cautious with what they spent the rest of their demon points on. There's a connection between beast and master, yes, but it's quite vague. For example, I can't understand exactly what Little Black Star is saying. I can only try to decipher it based on the emotions he's sending my way. Sending something as complicated as a mantra would be impossible. At the same time, the comprehension abilities of beasts are often based on their innate instincts. If I wanted them to learn a human-created technique like this one, it would be impossible. The only other way would be to have them naturally comprehend star runes on their own, but how could that be possible? Aina nodded slowly. Then what about the star runes themselves? How will they use star runes without stars? Will you teach them Dimensional Cleanse with this formation as well? No, I'm going to use a different method. According to this, it's possible to inscribe it directly onto their beast crystals. I just need to guide the process. Doing so will cause a qualitative change in their combat strength. Aina nodded again. She didn't really doubt Lionel, she just couldn't help but smile when he explained things. The path beasts took was inherently different from that of humans. For example, beasts were much more reliant on their ability indexes. Since we're on the topic of beasts, I should probably also try to find something that will help Little Black Star. He absorbed a Shadow Sovereign, so his ability index is much more powerful now than it was in the past, and before that he also absorbed Void Beast blood. The little guy is already very powerful because of that, so there's really not much to do outside of helping him inscribe some Darkness Star runes on his beast crystal. Maybe ask about Shadow Sovereign specifically, Aina said. Lionel nodded. That made sense. In fact, not that he thought about it, it would be good if they found out more about sovereigns in general. After asking and sifting through the items that appeared, Lionel was surprised to find that the root of sovereignty was actually in a domain. The shadow world of the shadow sovereigns, the spear domains of spear sovereigns, and blood domain of blood sovereigns. Being a sovereign meant having such an innate domain of your own, one that you could pull strength from whenever you wanted. Outside of this, though, the similarities between sovereigns mostly came to a stop and each had their own methods of improving and their own uniqueness. For example, Shadow Sovereign could absorb other Shadow Sovereigns. Blood Sovereigns could absorb blood to change their very constitution. Spear Sovereigns made all spears useless before them except in the face of another Spear Sovereign. The abilities were wide-ranging and they manifested in different ways. The only thing linking them was dominion over a certain domain. Lionel didn't end up finding anything Blackstar absolutely had to have, but he learned a lot more about this enigmatic sovereign title he kept hearing so much about before moving on. Wait. Lionel's gaze flashed. Show me materials related to making sovereigns. It was a shot in the dark, but Lionel felt that it was possible. If he was correct, the spear domain ring's real purpose was to create spear sovereigns. That was why that woman had mistaken him to be one. In addition, the abilities of a shadow sovereign seemed to be something you could pass along since they could be absorbed between them. Maybe if there was a catalyst, you could take the ability for yourself. Surprisingly, the shop really did have items of what Lionel needed. The first thing Lionel saw was a book called Path of the Spear. There were all sorts of books here named just like this but for different weapons as well. They were too expensive, just tens of millions of demon points. Lionel concluded from this that these books weren't rare, but considering the fact there weren't spear sovereigns running around everywhere, it obviously wasn't a simple task even if you had one. Just from their introduction, Lionel felt that they were far inferior to his spear domain heirloom in this respect. However, he still added them to the list because this systematic method of progression might contain secrets he could use to comprehend how to improve his other forces as well. In addition, they would help his brothers. Of course, he was also very interested in how to organically become a Bao sovereign as well. If there was anyone who could do it, he felt like he should probably be at the top of the list. After another scan, Lionel realized that there was nothing here about becoming a blood sovereign. It seemed that it was likely impossible to do so without being born one, or at the very least, they didn't have such methods here or they weren't willing to sell them. It also seemed, unfortunately, that this was also the case for shadow sovereignty. From the looks of it, only weapon sovereigns could be created, but even then, you needed great talent and affinity for the weapon to begin with. Still, Lionel was satisfied with adding those books to the list. He had a feeling that their comprehensive explanation of the path of weapons would be far better than anything he could find elsewhere. Like this, about 201 billion points are allocated for what's already on the list, so that's 10% of our budget gone already. Lionel's eyes narrowed. There was nothing he could do about how quickly the funds were disappearing, he could only press forward and take what he could get. Show me everything you have related to Scarlet Star Force, Lionel said. The human class sector hadn't had anything like this, but maybe the fiend class sector would. If not, he would also check everything they had related to Emulation Spatial Force. Since he was already starting way behind in the force manipulation game, he had to try to learn as much as he could. When the counter flashed and the items began to appear, Lionel's brows rose slowly. Chapter 16-17. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:18 a.m. Chapter 16-17. First step: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Destruction Sovereign. It wasn't the largest item that appeared, but it was definitely the one that grasped Lionel's attention the very quickest. It was just a book, and it didn't even seem to be a technique. All it told was a story and nothing else. In fact, the cost wasn't even 1,000 demon points. Still, it grabbed his attention and didn't let go. Lionel bought it immediately, not minding the minuscule number of points. He just had to know exactly what it was. The price was minuscule, and the reading material was even smaller. With Lionel's thinking speed, even though his dream force hadn't quite recovered, his pace of reading was simply too quick. In no more than just a few minutes, he had scoured through it all and his expression quickly became solemn. According to the book, there were two paths for those born with Scarlet Star Force. The first was to master it, and the second was to lose all rationale of who and what you were, becoming a harbinger of destruction. The title of Destruction Sovereign and Scarlet Star Innate Node Holder were one and the same. They were two fates tied into one. If Lionel had heard the words Anya spoke about him that day, he would have also come to understand exactly why she had chosen to say such a thing. It was only now that Lionel understood that the 100-year deadline Wise Star Order had given him was no small joke. It wasn't just his life that was on the line, it may very well be the lives of everyone. What Lionel also couldn't help but wonder was exactly who knew about this and how many did. Because, if they knew that such a thing would happen, would powers take precautions around him? Would they even try to deal with him before that happened? Lionel even had a feeling that the only reason he hadn't been taken control of like a savant and placed under lock and key was only because of who his father was. Anyone else would have been forced to suffer such a fate. Lionel took a breath and exhaled. Lionel? Lionel looked over toward Aina, his gaze flickering. But in the end, he handed her the book and her expression, too, became solemn. Luckily, Aina didn't know about Lionel's 100-year deadline, or else she might have reacted much more violently than she did now. In the end, Lionel could only chuckle. Everyone else got such useful sovereign abilities, why was his so annoying? But it couldn't be helped. Just like Wise Star Order had said, when a force reached a certain level, it would gain certain dispositions. At such high dimensions, these dispositions would be no less intrinsic than the very chemical structure of an object. This, in and of itself, was the secret behind the life grade, and it was also what gave true state forces such power. It wasn't just about the energy behind the attack, but also the artistic conception of it. It was just as, if not more important. Who knows, maybe the reason Aina wanted to have so many babies was only partly due to her past and was also just as related to her title of Blood Sovereign. Someone else in Aina's shoes could have very easily decided to never have children so that their kids wouldn't have to experience what they had. It was a conclusion that was just as valid and there was seemingly no real reason to choose one over the other, at least on the surface. Likewise, maybe the reason Little Blackstar was so mischievous was because of his role as a Shadow Sovereign. And maybe the reason Amory was so arrogant was because he was so close to becoming a Sword Sovereign. Of course, things were likely not so simple. An entire personality wouldn't be dictated by a force of a specific kind, but it could definitely influence you, much like any other environmental factor could. However, what would happen if you lost control of your true state force? Would it even be just a single environmental factor any longer? No, it would likely take you over completely, consume you, until all that was left was what it wanted you to be. And in the case of Lionel's Scarlet Star Force, it was all too obvious what it wanted to do. Destroy. Despite the weight of these words, Lionel felt that he had been enlightened about something. He didn't fear his innate node at all, and he was quite confident in succeeding in fully comprehending it within 100 years. However, this book shed light on exactly what it is he had within his body. There was a reason he had always called his runes Destruction Runes and not Scarlet Star Runes. That was always the root of it all, something that he knew subconsciously, but never truly put into practice. The flames were just a conduit, a guiding light. Thinking to this point, Lionel felt like he touched upon a unique sort of realm. This feels like it should be the first step toward truly understanding your force. What intent does it embody? If you can fully understand this, then your control over your force should take a step forward, but it's also not so simple. Simply by virtue of having a high affinity for a force, you should already subconsciously understand what its true essence or intent is. If you didn't, then you wouldn't have an affinity for it in the first place. This means that it's more than just about understanding it subconsciously. Something about bringing the subconscious into the conscious causes a change. It might just be a simple change at first, but as you move forward into the future, it will snowball. And then, Lionel flipped a palm over, causing a seemingly delicate flame to appear. But he already knew that this flame alone was easily twice as powerful as any he had ever manifested by pulling from atmospheric force. He had found the first step in improving his force manipulation. Chapter 16:18. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 59 seconds AM. Chapter 16:18. Mantras. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel nodded to himself and spent some time explaining his thoughts to Aina. When she understood this, she, too, frowned. This would be especially difficult for Aina. That's because Aina was inherently an instinct-first kind of fighter. Too much of her strength was reliant on the subconscious. Bringing these things to a state of conscious thought would be many times more difficult for her. It's still not set in stone, Lionel said. I know too little about this, and there may very well be a different process depending on the force in question or even the person themselves. Aina nodded, falling into her own thoughts. As she did so, Lionel looked toward the other items related to his Scarlet Star Force. Unsurprisingly, a large majority of them were designed to defend against it. There was even a technique that boasted to have such strong defense that even Scarlet Star Force wouldn't be able to make a path through it. Lionel's eyes landed on a tattered sword. It had lost its tip and it was cracked in several places, and yet it had a price tag of over 10 billion. Lionel wasn't a swordsman, so the weapon itself was meaningless to him. And, even if it had been a spear, his spear domain ring would have shattered it. He might have only had some interest if it was a bow or arrow. At least initially. But Lionel still gave it a second look for one simple reason: why would a broken sword appear here? He got his answer the moment he read the description. According to what was here, this sword used to have a core formed by a small vein of Scarlet Star Force. Apparently, this vein shattered and ruined the integrity of the sword, making it incredibly weak. Now, it was barely as strong as a silver-grade weapon. The description was benign, but when Lionel read this, his brows shot up. This description seemed to imply that the sword was just fine despite having such a vein within it, and Lionel found that very difficult to accept. When Lionel tried forging with destruction runes, the weapon in question didn't even last a few seconds before disintegrating. But this sword had survived with a Scarlet Star vein inside of it. A force vein in this context was essentially a piece of force crystal. This meant that this sword had been able to conjure Scarlet Star Force and avoid damaging itself in the process. In its prime, it had been a life-grade item. But now, it had been destroyed. Interesting, Lionel added the sword to the list. He had a feeling that if he studied it, and dream sculpted it, he would be able to get a peek at exactly how the sword managed to retain its integrity. In addition to that, he might also find out some secrets that would help him deepen his understanding of his Scarlet Star Force and help him to further progress. Lionel swept his gaze over the items once more just to check if he would find anything interesting, and his eyes landed on a tattered beast cloth that made his eyes pop out of their sockets. This wasn't because of what was written on it, but rather the price tag. It was double the price of anything he had added to the list until now and sat at 200 billion. That would eat away another 10% of the funds the two of them had. So it's a mantra fragment. I see, Lionel didn't expect the mantra fragment for Scarlet Star Force to be so absolutely ridiculous. It was just a small piece of it, and it only had the complete method for the 4th, 5th, and 6th dimensions, a level Lionel was already at, yet it cost so much. Wouldn't he go bankrupt if it was the full thing? Lionel shook his head and began to go through his forces one by one and added the partial mantra to the very bottom of the list. It would be the easiest to ignore by far. Once he was done, he moved on to his other forces. He looked through the items for Dream Force, Emulation Spatial Force, Vital Star Force, Void Star Force, Aurora Star Force and Ethereal Star Force. He found another fragment for Void Star Force which also cost 200 billion. But this time Lionel knew he couldn't afford to miss out on it. He had his innate node for Scarlet Star Force, and although the mantras might hold the secret to force manipulation, there were simply too many other useful things here. His Void Star Force, though, didn't have an innate node he could rely upon. So although this was just the fourth, fifth and sixth dimensional layers, it was far too useful to ignore. He added it to nearer the top of the list, but he was also prepared to give it up if it really came to it. As for the other forces, they were far cheaper, relatively anyway. Lionel wasn't sure why, but Dream Force items were exceptionally cheap. It didn't make much sense since Dream Force was an exceptionally high-level force, no less than a true state force. But for whatever reason, there were a large amount of items and they were also inexpensive. The only unfortunate part was that most of them required one to be able to manifest Dream Force outside of their bodies, something Lionel could not do before. The good news was that Lionel should finally be able to do so at least through his new emulation spatial force innate node. In the end, though, most of the techniques here could have their function replaced by Lionel's ability to project his dream world. With emulation spatial force and his dream world, he would finally be able to give his projections a real form. And, with his high dream force affinity, he should be able to use it to a better degree than Thela, should he catch up with her force manipulation abilities, that is. Chapter 1619. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 58 seconds AM. Chapter 1619. Rebuild if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. As for the remaining forces, Lionel found the mantras for them all and added them to the list. By the time he was done, another 500 billion demon points had been potentially allocated for a total of 700 billion. Of this 500 billion, 200 billion was for the Void Star Force mantra fragment, but surprisingly, another 200 billion was allocated toward Vital Star Force. The mantra for Vital Star Force cost 100 billion. Luckily, it was completed. But Lionel also allocated another 100 billion to a technique that caught his attention. The technique was called Vital Forge. It used Vital Star Force and recreated effects similar to what Lionel had experienced in the Dimensional Cleanse trial world. It created an exceptionally heavy atmosphere and it took advantage of the great density of Vital Star Force to push other forces away. This technique could be used one of two ways. The first was the most obvious, and that was as a domain of sorts. Much like the Dimensional Cleanse world, it was a great suppressive tactic. The second, though, was the real reason Lionel chose it, and that was because it could be used as a training method. What drew Lionel to it wasn't the fact that he could use it on himself, but rather that he could use it on others to slowly push out more of their potential. If this was used in conjunction with refined demons, the benefits would be even more outstanding. In addition, demons were a limited commodity. Although Lionel and Aina had killed hundreds, they would eventually run out. Using this method, though, there would be a method of continuously improving his friends and subordinates. In fact, there was even a method within this technique to set up a formation so that Lionel wouldn't have to act personally. As for the remaining 100 billion, it was used on the other forces, including rudimentary mantra that touched upon the simplest of the elements. Everything from fire all the way to space. These mantras were the simplest and most wide-ranging. Lionel had added these to the list for two reasons. Firstly, he would have all his bases covered when it came to the mantras his people would need. And, secondly, there was a small chance he might be able to find a method to combine the effects to gain what he needed. For example, if he took the fire mantra, light mantra and star mantra, and managed to fuse them, could he get something close to what he needed for his Scarlet Star Force? It wasn't likely since there was more than one Fire-Light Star Force in existence, just like there was an Aurora Star Force to the existing Chaotic Particle Force, both of which were Earth Dark Star Forces. But, Lionel thought that it was worth a try. Within this price, Lionel had also gotten a mantra for Aina. With the Blood Sovereign tablet, Aina didn't need Life Force, Blood Force, or what she called Coercion Force mantras. But her new Chaos body had come with the use of a top 5 lightning force known as Blaze Lightning Force. The Blaze Lightning Force mantra took up at least 20% of the price all on its own. 700 billion used up, potentially. This leaves about 1.3 trillion remaining. The points were disappearing quite quickly, but Lionel could only sigh. Until now, he had only added auxiliary items and there was nothing that directly increased his strength or survivability, at least not without time. The good news was that such things should probably be cheaper. It only made sense that techniques, formation methods, and mantras would be more expensive than usual treasures. Alright, it seems like with all that out of the way, I can focus on more tangible resources now. That choice I made should pay off now. The choice Lionel was referring to was something that happened while he was being eaten alive. While the experience was absolutely horrible, it also provided him with an opportunity. The first opportunity was watching his body be reconstructed once again from the ground up. He had memorized that process in its entirety, down to the smallest detail, so his comprehension of his body, his lineage factors, and how they interacted was on a whole other level. The second opportunity was related to his divine armors. Usually, Lionel's divine armors would regenerate along with himself. But this time, he chose to purposely shatter the kernels they represented. Not only did he shatter them, but he also undid the work he had gone through with his metal body as well. Right now, Lionel's body had lost much of its metallic properties and he could be considered to just be a normal six-dimensional existence without an added boost to bodily strength. Being eaten alive was horrible, but it allowed Lionel to hit the reset and undo many of the mistakes he had in the past. The first thing he wanted to do was rebuild his affinities. He had originally built his metal body to resist his Scarlet Star Force. This was a poor choice on his part and clashed with his divine armors. The best function of metal body and divine armor was in building affinities, and they worked the best together. But Lionel already had a high fire and light affinity, but he wasted his metal body in consuming more to increase it even further. He had taken the wrong approach to begin with. And second, he wanted to rebuild his divine armors. Originally, his first divine armor was heavily reliant on spatial affinities, and his second was more of a water force and spatial force fusion. They didn't stack well together and that was a problem. In addition, if Lionel fused with Thila's innate node perfectly, then he wouldn't need his divine armors to provide him spatial force affinity any longer since he would now have dominion over a top 5 spatial force. So, Lionel had already decided what he would do. He would rebuild his metal body based on water force and vital star force. He would then rebuild his divine armors with his current level of skill around these two forces as well. The multiplicative stacking effect would be able to bring out the true power of his metal synergy bloodline, and he had a whole shop worth of stuff to scoop up. It would never be easier for Lionel to gather up the materials he needed than right now. Chapter 1620. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1620. 500 billion. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel didn't want to have to get eaten again to gain another opportunity like this one. If it wasn't for his mental fortitude and his powerful mind, he may very well have lost his sanity entirely. So, no matter what, he had to get things right this time. He chose water force and vital star force after much deliberation, but he felt like it was the right choice to make. The choice of water was the most obvious. It was the one affinity that he really needed that he didn't have. During the reconstruction of his body, he realized that Aina had been very correct. He had a very strong dark force affinity, one that he didn't quite understand even now. In fact, it wasn't just dark force, it was something else that he couldn't seem to grasp fully. He didn't know why this was, but he had a feeling that it was related to his father's appearance that day in the Rapax next. He would have to wait until that old man appeared again to ask, or he would have to see if the dictionary had an answer for him. Who knew, maybe his father had left him behind another one of those messages. This aside, of the three forces that made up Void Star Force, the one that Lionel didn't have was Water Force. He needed to focus more on increasing its strength and only then would he be able to build up to creating the Void Star Force armor he wanted to. In addition to this, aside from Earth Force, Water Force was maybe the greatest at defense. In fact, the two forces were usually neck and neck, having an equivalent number of forces between the two of them that had excellent defensive prowess. If Lionel restructured his body with an Earth Force and Water Force fusion, its defenses would be even more exaggerated than it had been in the past. Not only would he be able to resist blows, but even for the ones he couldn't just outright tank, he would be able to disperse them and weaken their impact. He could maximize these effects as well by choosing water force ores that were especially known for such abilities too. When it came to vital star force, while Lionel's general star force affinity was exceptionally high thanks to his scarlet star force, he didn't have a specific affinity for vital star force itself. Due to this, while his ability to use vital star force was far above his ability to use void star force, it wasn't as high as it could be. If put into perspective, Lionel's fire force affinity was at an 11 on a scale of 1 to 10. His light force affinity was at a 10 on that same scale, and his star force affinity was between an 8 and 9. However, his affinity for vital star force specifically was at around a 6 to a 7. This was actually quite excellent and far more than the vast majority of people. But Lionel felt that he would greatly benefit by raising that number to a 9 and maybe even potentially a 10 in the future. The reason that Lionel was lacking in vital star force affinity was because it was 1 part life force and 1 part star force, and he very much lacked in life force. So, in reality, it was much more accurate to say that Lionel would be building up his metal body with life force related ores instead to slowly boost his affinity. As he did so, his star fusion, self-created technique would gain far more strength, and rather than just boosting his body, it would even gain the ability to directly boost the strength of his divine armor as well. Evolution ore, when fused into Lionel's divine armor, gave it an ability to transcend its level, but it was still only in a quasi-state. After all, it couldn't truly give a 5th-dimensional or the strength of a 6th-dimensional one. However, if the effects of the evolution ore were stacked with Lionel's star fusion ability, the results would be truly transcendent. At that point, so long as Lionel summoned his armor and activated star fusion, it would truly be like his metal body had crossed a dimensional barrier to the next level. When this was combined with Lionel's breakthrough in force crafting, the Morales family's divine armor technique would truly begin to display might it never had before. The ores Lionel needed for his 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th-dimensional metal body and divine armor were all dirt cheap in comparison to the things he had been buying previously. In fact, he even managed to find a large supply of evolution ore here for just as cheap. Thanks to his mother, Lionel already had a set of 6th-dimension evolution ore, so he didn't need to trade for them. This was a good thing because past this point, things really began to get expensive. It had to be remembered that 6th-dimension evolution ore could allow a 6th-dimensional ore to display 7th-dimensional properties, so it was already valued at a 7th-dimensional level. This was why it was so shocking that Lionel's mother had managed to get him a full batch's worth. This meant that 7th-dimensional evolution ore was valued at an 8th-dimensional level. Lionel found a batch here to trade for to help future-proof himself, but the cost was steep at 500 billion demon points. This just went to show just how rare evolution ores were. Many of the other things on Lionel's list had 9th-dimensional secrets within them, but they still weren't expensive. The mantras, for example, all had enough chance and force arts within to produce 9th-dimensional star runes, and yet they were only a fraction of the price. Though, to be fair, just a fragment of the Scarlet Star Force mantra was 200 billion. Lionel grit his teeth and added the 7th-dimensional evolution ore nearer to the bottom of the list. Everything else he needed, even the 7th-dimensional ores he had chosen for his 7th-dimensional divine armor in the future, didn't even amount to 10 billion. But the evolution ores alone were actually so expensive. Chapter 1621. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 1621. Hard link. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Ultimately, the 7th dimension was still too far away for Lionel. If he could afford it in the end, he would buy it. But he wouldn't tank his chances at everything else just to secure something he wouldn't be able to use for years. He was still very happy that he had gathered up so many materials. He wouldn't need to worry about anything. When he got the time and little Tolly back, he would be able to calmly craft. By then, his strength should increase by leaps and bounds. When Lionel got to this point, he was tempted to see what he could get in this world about force crafting, but then an idea flashed in his mind. Show me what you have related to army and empire building. Aina nodded by Lionel's side. She agreed with this too. Although she no longer called Lionel, my king, as her point had long since already been made, that didn't mean that she had changed her mind. She wanted to see him rise to the top as well, and right now, she was well aware of just how far behind his cousins he was. In addition, Aina felt that it would be naive to believe that only she and Lionel would manage to gain something from this place. If Lionel's cousins were great geniuses like everyone seemed to say they were, then in all likelihood, they would manage to find a way to benefit as well. If Lionel didn't take this opportunity, he might not receive another one that was as good. As expected. Lionel mumbled to himself as he scanned through the items. The vast majority here were formation-type items, as this would be the foundation of most powerful empires. If you didn't have a strong large-scale force art, capable of pulling from the atmosphere and protecting your territory, it would be all too easy for others to infiltrate and cripple your foundation. What Lionel hadn't expected, though, was for there to be force arts for armies as well. He had only casually thrown the additional like in, as he also wanted something that bolstered his subordinates' battle prowess, but this was greatly unexpected. So this is possible too. It must work on concepts of resonance, a lot like Grandpa's music phase of spear mastery. I keep running into this concept again and again. To think that it could be applied like this. These army formations went by many names, but the most commonly used was the term heart link. Heart link force arts could exist as separate entities, but they could still be considered like parts of a single whole. As such, they had two stages, the normal stage and the linked stage. Lionel obviously couldn't see the full network of force arts since he would have to outright buy them for that, but with his knowledge of force arts, he could make guesses by using the descriptions and the sneak previews. Heart link force arts essentially fuse the power of multiple practitioners into a single focal point, forming a large and powerful army formation capable of destroying everything in its path. However, they weren't cheap. Even the most inexpensive one here was just 10 billion. The most expensive one, though, was over 10 trillion demon points, crushing Lionel's budget by 5 times. When Lionel saw this, he was, quite frankly, speechless. He and Aina had the most points of anyone when their wealth was combined, but they still couldn't afford something in this shop. Maybe the most shocking part was that this 10 trillion demon point heart link formation was only designed for up to 107th dimensional existences to use at once. This meant that despite its price tag, it couldn't even be used by those with 8th dimensional strength or above because the system would be overloaded. In comparison, the cheapest one could be used by up to 100,000 5th dimensional existences at once. It was clear and obvious that size truly didn't matter in this case. For there to be such an enormous price difference, there had to be a reason. When reading the description, though, the answer was obvious. The 10 trillion demon point formation only needed 100 tier 1 7th dimensional existences to wield the power of a tier 1 8th dimensional existence. And, if you managed to gather 100 tier 9 7th dimensional existences, then you would have the power of a tier 9 8th dimensional existence. The cheapest formation was similar, but it required 100,000 individuals to jump up an entire dimension. Of course, it was easier to find 100,000 5th dimensional existences than it was to find 100,000 7th dimensional existences. But odds were, if you had such a number of 5th dimensional existences willing to listen to your commands, then you also weren't lacking in 6th dimensional existences either, and this heart link force art would be more like a cherry on the top for you. This also didn't mention the weakness of the cheapest formation either, and that was that twofold. Firstly, it wasn't plug and play and required comprehension on the part of the soldiers. And secondly, all 100,000 had to have the same affinity. These affinities didn't have to be exactly the same, but they had to share the same base element. Meaning, you had to have 100,000 existences with fire force affinity, for example. The most expensive formation didn't have these drawbacks. So long as you built the army's armors to the proper specifications and the users had the appropriate strength, that was all the requirements you needed to meet. Of course, the worst part about both of these heart link force arts was that having the force art was just the beginning. These force arts would obviously need to be drawn on something, and that something would be armors. In order to withstand the power of such a resonance, these armors wouldn't be cheap either. So, even if Lionel had 10 trillion demon points to spend, he would need another 10 trillion or so to build the 100 armors he would need. Plus, that didn't address the biggest elephant in the room. He himself wasn't in the 7th dimension. Where would he get 100 such existences from, exactly? If he had such powerful subordinates, would he even need to worry about this air war to begin with? Chapter 1622. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 1622. Only 2 grades if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. That's unfortunate, Aina said lightly. However, when she looked toward Lionel, all she saw was a wild grin. It's not unfortunate at all. In fact, I'm at least 80% certain that I can create my own. I understand the principle behind it already, and I think I have the skill to surpass this by a large margin. Aina blinked, her gaze sparkling. She didn't doubt Lionel. He wasn't one to speak without cause. In fact, he usually preferred to not speak at all. It could be said that if it wasn't for their relationship, he would have just kept this to himself, quietly calculating until he figured it all out. I have a feeling that these aren't the best formations this world has to offer. With their comprehension of force manipulation, they should have force crafting leagues beyond what I can do currently. Look at this one here, Lionel pointed to the most expensive one. It looks grand and imposing, but the truth is though they require 7th dimensional existences, the actual design for the base armor the army would use is just for a set of 100 silver grade armors. Although they use higher class materials to make up for it, such a shoddy design couldn't possibly step into the gold grade, let alone the life grade. The black grade was the 4th dimensional equivalent, and likewise, the silver grade was 6th dimensional, the gold grade 7th, and the life grade 8th. This formation required 7th dimensional existences, and even the armors used 7th dimensional materials, and even some 8th, but Lionel still evaluated the overall product as silver grade. It's clear that whoever created this heart-link force art is an expert in formations, but when it comes to force crafting, they're very lacking. So, to make up for their weaknesses, they could only throw money at the problem, using very expensive materials to make up for lack of skill and foreplanning. Aina's gaze flickered. Right now, Lionel was casually commenting on silver grade and above grade armors, but wasn't he too in the 6th dimension? What stage had his force crafting reached, exactly? Did you become a gold grade force crafter? Aina asked. Gold grade? Lionel paused for a moment before smiling mysteriously. Strictly speaking, I can create life grade items now. Aina's brows jumped, her heart beating erratically. Life grade? Wasn't that 8th dimensional? How was that even possible? Lionel laughed. You probably think that I mean I can create 8th dimensional items, right? No, I can't do that. But my creations could display prowess far above the level of the materials I used to create them, that much is certain. I just view things differently now. Black grade, bronze grade, silver grade, gold grade, life grade. I don't think that there are so many categories of weapons and treasures as I see it. To me, there's only what is life grade and what isn't. Lionel's eyes sparkled like the radiant beams of the sun. If it wasn't for the fact the demon world had no materials to use, would he even have been put in such a sorry situation? Absolutely not. You mean? Aina whispered softly. I mean that what separates life grade and gold grade is an item that is so perfect it transcends the individual materials used to create it to form a new whole. This item forms a spirit, a lot like true state forces have personalities of their own because it becomes a supremely unique existence of its own, a new life, if you will. I just mean that regardless of the dimension, I'm certain that I can create crafts that can reach that state. Lionel shifted his gaze from Aina and looked back toward the most expensive heart-link formation. According to this, the armors that are needed are quasi-life grade. But I'm pretty certain you could throw any 8th dimensional material into a crafting process and then call it quasi-life grade because by virtue of its existence alone, the weapon would be supremely powerful. But as I see it, it's just all fake nonsense. This can't be considered quasi-life grade, at best, it's silver grade. Right now, the only thing holding me back from crafting high-level silver-grade crafts and beyond is my own weakness. My force isn't powerful enough, my finger designation is still too low, and little Tali is still an infant. In the future, though, I don't think I'll experience any bottlenecks in force crafting until I reach the true life grade and the 8th dimension. I see. Aina nodded. If things were as Lionel said, then it really wouldn't be difficult for him at all to create his own formation. Now that he knew it existed, he could form his own. Although he couldn't be able to make one capable of using 7th dimensional existences due to his own weaknesses, he would definitely be able to make one that utilized 6th dimensional existences to battle 7th dimensional ones given some time. In fact, Lionel was even thinking of forming a 2-person heart link force art that could only be used by himself and Aina. Or maybe a 2-person one that could resonate between himself and Little Blackstar. And the best part about all of this was, he would finally get to create his own cool uniforms. A 2-person one could either be much less complicated or much more depending on how you look at it. It's obviously much easier to produce great strength with more people as opposed to less. But a 2-person formation obviously has less variables as well. But this should work out nicely. With things like this, Aina won't have to sing in battle for us to resonate anymore. And, given our talent, our bodies can also take much more pressure than most army soldiers would be able to. This could definitely work well. Lionel nodded to himself and just let a section of his split minds handle the computations. There was nothing else of interest among the items and he didn't need any empire formations just yet as he didn't even have a base of operations. In addition, since he would form his own heart link formation, he didn't care to add any of these to the list, so he simply moved on. Now, he had less than 800 billion demon points remaining and he had to make the most of it. Show me items related to metal spirits. Chapter 1623. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 1623. Maturity. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Little Tali was Lionel's greatest reliance. In fact, even in comparison to Little Blackstar, the little one was Lionel's greatest partner. If Lionel prepared things for Blackstar, he couldn't possibly forget about Tolliver. Lionel hadn't really done anything special for Tolliver in his lifetime. Outside of feeding the little one as many ores as it could manage, there was really nothing else to do. At the same time, though, Lionel had to be careful about this. This was because he had never forgotten his father's first lesson about the hazards of metal spirits and how overeating could cause them to go berserk. Due to this, Lionel was very careful with how he fed little Tali and the little one's progress was quite slow, although consistent, as a result. As of now, little Tali should still be in the 5th dimension, and the little guy wasn't close to the 6th. This could be considered to be another limitation to Lionel's force crafting. As a metal spirit, working with and manipulating 6th-dimensional ores even while in the 5th dimension wasn't impossible. But it took effort, and it also required a lot of stamina on Lionel's part as well. Only when little Tali entered the 6th dimension would things become much easier. When the items appeared, Lionel quickly scanned them all one by one, his expression flickering with surprise from time to time. The first category of items were about guiding little Tali into maturity. Lionel had learned long ago that spirit familiars were genderless. Usually, they would choose as they pleased once they reached this point of maturity. Lionel hadn't really thought much about it before, but he never really considered exactly what maturity meant. According to these, maturity to metal spirits was like a hack to progressing through the life grade. The current little Tali could only bend and manipulate metals as Lionel directed, liquefying them and controlling them at will. However, a mature Tolliver would be on a completely different level. In fact, a mature metal spirit could even give birth to ores that didn't exist by taking and fusing together the essence of existing ores. Essentially, if there wasn't an ore in existence that perfectly fit Lionel's needs, Tali would be capable of forging them at Lionel's behest. This wasn't all, it was even possible for little Tali to perfect ores. For example, dark ice ore was a 5th-dimensional ore. It wasn't perfect enough to be a 6th-dimensional Oregon. With proper preparations, little Tolly would be able to improve these weaknesses and allow it to evolve to a whole new level. Essentially, when paired with an evolution ore, little Tolly could take the quasi-effect granted by the evolution ore and turn it into a true and permanent effect. This could be considered an extension of its fusion abilities. As for why this was a hack to progressing through the life grade, wasn't the life grade exactly this? Wasn't it the creation of a treasure so perfect that it could be seen as a new entity all to itself? Essentially what this meant is that a mature metal spirit would make forging life-grade weapons thousands of folds easier. Even for Lionel, if he wanted to forge a life-grade item, he would need to spend a lot of energy blueprinting and even tweaking force arts so that everything would fit together perfectly. However, with little Tolly maturing, he would need to fit himself into rigid boxes already outlined by what ores could naturally exist. Theoretically, he could create an ore that was perfect in all aspects, dealing with all potential weaknesses in one fell swoop. What was interesting, though, was that not all mature metal spirits were created equal. If Lionel's deductions were correct, the sooner after the fifth dimension a metal spirit matured, the more potential it would have into the future. In this way, it was a lot like the God path for humans. Beyond this, there were actually several paths a metal spirit could take when stepping into maturity as well. The first was the mimicry path, a lot like Little Blackstar's path. Because ores of all types existed, and a metal spirit could eat them all, they could start taking on these characteristics as well. In fact, this was the most common path for metal spirits. Lionel was surprised when he read this. This was almost identical to his metal bodis properties, no? It felt like it was likely that these techniques were actually birthed from observing metal spirits. The second path was the fusion path. This path leaned into a metal spirit's ability to combine and create new life through ores. In fact, a metal spirit that took this path would even gain powerful healing abilities that it could share with its owner. This was a much rarer path, and it allowed a metal spirit exceedingly powerful abilities in creating new alloys and ores, much more so than most metal spirits. While some less mature metal spirits would be limited to combining 2 ores at most, a metal spirit on this path would be able to fuse 3, 4, or even 5 instantly upon maturing. The third path was the universal path. This metal spirit was able to tap into universal force to help their partner during the forging practice. Those with this metal spirit had seemingly endless stamina and could forge hundreds of weapons at once without the slightest issue. The fourth and final path was the pure path. This metal spirit was a jack of all trades but a master of none. However, depending on the resources it was fed, it would likewise be able to improve in all areas. This path was by far the most expensive and the most involved. And the requirements were exceedingly difficult to meet. In order to take this path, one had to allow one's metal spirit to step into the 6th dimension while under a force eruption. Such a requirement truly left Lionel speechless. Of course, the worst part was that this was just the introduction. If he wanted the complete method, he needed to pay 500 billion demon points. Chapter 1624. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 53 seconds AM. Chapter 1624. Most popular. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel could only grit his teeth and add the method to the list, leaving him with only 300 billion demon points. Of which, he used an extra 100 billion to allocate the materials he would need to help the process along, ultimately leaving him with 200 billion demon points he had yet to use. Suddenly, Lionel felt very poor. In truth, there was a chance that little Tolly could mature naturally along the 4th path. In fact, all 4 of these evolution paths were available to all metal spirits. However, there was a reason that some were rarer than others. In order of rarity, the first was the most common, with the 4th path being the rarest to see. Metal spirits were rare already, but those that could naturally enter the 4th path were less than 1 in 10,000. With the vast majority entering the first, about 10% entering the second, and about 1% entering the third. Lionel simply couldn't leave his fate up to a 0.1% chance, so he had to take matters in his own hand. The trouble was that it cost 600 billion demon points. He didn't even know where he would find a force eruption. He had only experienced one in his lifetime, and that was back on Earth. However, obviously, he couldn't use a mere fourth-dimensional force eruption. It had to at least be a sixth-dimensional force eruption, which was only likely to happen when a world was evolving from the fifth dimension to the sixth. Earth was obviously a great candidate for this, as it would be entering the sixth dimension soon. But he would still have to rely on a bit of luck, as he wouldn't exactly be able to predict where they would appear. Lionel shook his head. There was no use in harping on these matters. He had 200 billion left, and he had to see if he maximized it or if he would have to start shedding some things from his list. I think we should think about protective treasures. All of this will be useless if we can't protect our lives, Aina suddenly said. And after that, we can take a look at the most sought-after items here, or maybe even the most expensive ones, to see if there's anything that we absolutely have to have. Lionel nodded. He agreed with this. After filtering for protective treasures, he nodded. They were expensive, but they weren't ridiculously so. Even a one-time protective item capable of blocking up to a tier 1/8 dimensional strike was only about 100 billion. This made sense. After all, everything that Lionel was trading for could be considered Foundation's treasures and techniques for families and organizations, while such an item was just a protective treasure. Techniques and similar things would always be far more expensive. If he got one for himself and Aina, that would make up for the remaining 200 billion they had left. But that wasn't strictly necessary. This was because the protective treasure formed by forming a protective sphere that couldn't crack until it was overloaded. Taking Aina with him, or vice versa, would essentially make sure the both were protected. However, Lionel still put both on the list just in case of potential variables. If it came down to it, he would give up one and only buy one that he gave to Aina. Lionel was of half a mind not to tempt himself any further, but he knew that if he didn't this there wouldn't have been a point to the list in the first place. He might as well have just bought everything outright. Show me the most popular items exchanged for by the fiend-class geniuses. Lionel's gaze flickered, focusing on the items that appeared. Since he had asked for something so narrow, it wasn't too surprising that only 2 items appeared. The first was a crystal ball. It looked completely inconspicuous, and Lionel wouldn't have given it a second look if he saw it on a counter in a store. But when he read the description, his brows couldn't help but jump. Focus crystal, 10 billion. The price was cheap, or at least relatively so. This made sense since it was the most popular item. If only the top 10 could trade for it, it wouldn't be much of a popular item at all. According to the description, the focus crystal was a rare item used to refine force. One poured their force into it and it would come out purer. When used over a long period of time, this would purify the force within your body, bringing it closer to the kind of force one would only gain from pure force crystals. This was extremely similar to the ability of the golden-scaled koi fish. The difference, though, lied in the fact that this crystal catalyzed changes within your body, while the koi fish only did so with external force and within its own body. If one used a focus crystal daily, it would slowly improve one's affinity for one's element, and it would even help one to increase one's understanding of one's force. If used in conjunction with a mantra, the results would be even better. The only limitation of the focus crystal, and maybe the reason for its low price, was that it could only ever be used for one type of force. Once it was used, it wouldn't be able to purify any other kind of force, even if they shared the same element. Lionel exhaled when he saw this. This was an item he definitely had to have. And he needed multiple of them for sure. And Aina would need at least one for her Blaze Thunder Force, even if she didn't need it for her Blood Force and Life Force. Even if he ignored his lineage factors, he would still need 3 for himself plus 1 for Aina, which would make 40 billion demon points. Lionel shook his head and turned toward the second popular item before smiling bitterly. Chapter 1625. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 52 seconds AM. Chapter 1625. Most expensive if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. The second item was a seemingly ordinary black rock. Perfection stone, 100 billion. This rock's ability was very simple. It scanned a person and morphed into a clone. However, this clone would detect your weaknesses and fix them. The issue was that the rock wouldn't be able to communicate exactly what these issues were. According to the description, it was a rock forged in a very famous dream force-dense region. It was able to project the consciousness of the universe by simulating what it could have done with a talent of your caliber if you appeared in a zone. It would simulate your life based on your age and then form a clone that could be considered the perfected version of yourself. The only way to slowly tease apart the details was to fight this rock again and again, not to mention getting beat up again and again. How could you defeat the perfect version of yourself? It was only after reading these things that Lionel finally understood why it was that all the Dream Force-related items in this place were so cheap. In fact, if not for this, let alone 100 billion, this perfection stone might not be able to be bought with even 100 trillion. The description stated that this rock was a treasure of the Eternal Dream Pavilion. If Lionel was correct, this Eternal Dream Pavilion had subsidized many of the Dream Force items in this place. According to his understanding, talents with exceptionally high Dream Force affinity were too rare, but this was precisely what the pavilion demanded of their students. Although they hadn't sent their students, they were still in the business of fostering Dream Force talents in hopes that more would appear. It was also potentially the case that in exchange for not participating, they had given these tributes over. These were just Lionel's guesses, and he might be missing a few details, but he felt that this was very close to being true. The good news about this perfection stone was that it could be used for as many people as you wanted. It was no wonder it was such a popular item. Lionel realized that he had to have it. The abilities of the people of this world's ability to simulate was definitely far above his own. This would be an invaluable item and it would help him too greatly in the future. He didn't believe that it was truly perfect, but he would definitely use it as a guiding light. If zones could produce such perfect magic systems that humans couldn't even dream of thinking up on their own, why wouldn't the perfection stone be capable of refining his future path and allowing him to observe it? Now the trouble was that he was missing 30 to 40 billion demon points to buy this even if he gave up one of the protective treasures. Lionel exhaled and made a decision. He moved some of the things from Little Tolly's evolution down, then he would be able to afford it. Ultimately, the things he needed to facilitate Little Tolly's evolution, which amounted to an extra 100 billion, were things that he could find outside of this zone. But this stone was something he definitely could not. Plus, it would still take him some time to find a force eruption. So, he had time to gather the materials as well. Lionel exhaled. Show us the top 10 most expensive items you have here. Lionel still decided to go through with it. Who knew, maybe he would find something worth giving up everything for. If he could afford it, that is. What Lionel and Aina actually saw, though, was enough to leave them stunned. Every single one of the 10 items was a tablet. Most were gold, but there were 2 that were silver and 2 that were bronze. These were precisely the 12-pointed star lineage factor tablets, both the dark star half and the light star half. Lionel's eyes widened when, for the first time, his gaze landed on the gold tablets for this lineage factor. But almost the moment he did, he heard 2 roars resound in his mind. His eyes, nose, and ears burst into a rain of blood. He could see or hear anything, his body falling back, unconscious. Lionel. Aina's expression changed and quickly caught Lionel before his head hit the ground. She hesitated, wanting to look at the tablets as well, but she refrained, realizing that she might end up in the same state of Lionel. At that point, which one of them would be conscious to protect the other? Lionel mumbled, snapping out of his unconsciousness before he faded back into again. Every time his brain turned back on, he remembered those images and his body shut down again. Even without ever having laid eyes on those 2 beasts before, he knew exactly what their names were as though they had etched into his mind, almost like it was disrespectful for him to not know of them when he laid eyes on them. The pinnacle of the light star half of the lineage factor. The Infinity Beast. The pinnacle of the dark star half of the lineage factor. The Void Beast. The Void Beast. The Void Beast was the peak of the dark half of his lineage factor. In addition, there was actually a beast he had never heard of that was its exact opposite and equal. However, Lionel's memory was too perfect. Before he focused on those 2 tablets, he was certain that he had seen the names and descriptions of all the other tablets as well. For one, their prices were egregious, so much so that it felt almost like a slap to the face. They had so many zeros behind them that even Lionel didn't know what number that was supposed to represent. All he knew was that it was too much larger than just 1,000,000,000,000. But the second shocked him maybe even more than finding out what the pinnacle beasts of his lineage factor were. Emperor's Might. It was a tablet here. It sat with its own radiant gold light, exuding an air of unbridled arrogance and majesty. Just what did it mean for it to be here? Just what kind of zone was this? And why did it mention the Brazinger family in its description? What the hell did the greatest powers of Earth have to do with a fairy tale-based mythological zone? Chapter 1626. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 51 seconds AM. Chapter 1626. Fingertips. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel coughed before his expression turned solemn. There were too many things about this zone that confused him, too many questions he wanted to ask that no one would give him an answer to. Could it be that this wasn't a mythological zone and it was instead a variant zone? It had to be remembered that variant zones signified the end of a world. They appeared when a territory was at a crossroads and they would either face annihilation or deviate toward the correct path and prosper far more than they ever had before. What was most important to note about variant zones though, in this case at least, wasn't the opportunity they presented, but rather the fact that variant zones were a peek into the future. If this was the case, then maybe this all made sense. The evolution in force manipulation, the prominence of the families of Earth, the unique changes to the techniques and paths those of this world took, could it be that this world was actually Earth all along? But then where did these demons come from? Was it the influence of the Silver Empire? Did the Silver Empire make a comeback and cause all of this to occur, forcing the people of Earth to share the only 8th-dimensional world of the human domain with them? This was also a possibility. He had heard of the people here mentioning spirituals, so all of this was potentially true. The only thing that didn't quite add up was that this world was far too large to be the original Earth. But then again, just how large was the Void Palace? Clearly there were methods of making higher dimensional worlds break the laws of physics he was used to from the 3rd dimension. Anything was possible with the use of force, but still, even if Lionel's deductions were all correct, there were still more questions than there were answers. Such a variant zone, how could anyone bear to give it up? Did whoever attacked the Void Palace have to use such a precious zone for a task like this? It also had to be remembered that variant zones were known for their ease relative to other zones of the same level. Their entire purpose was to give those of their past a chance to transcend the difficulties that would block them from getting to the best possible future. This meant that this zone was invaluable if it was a variant zone originally. If not for the fact the likes of Lionel and the others failed immediately upon entering, the harshness they faced wouldn't have been nearly as difficult to transcend. In fact, maybe the methods of force manipulation and the like would have been handed to them on a silver platter rather than him having to go through all of this trouble. Were the people who used this zone to target the Void Palace fools? Even if there was a 100% guarantee of dealing with the Void Palace completely, who cared? So what if the Void Palace was gone? Weren't there still other races? Other powerhouses? Plus, there were still the most powerful families of the human domain that remained untouched. On top of that, there was one person that Lionel was absolutely certain was doing just fine, his father. To deal with the human race, some fool actually chose to target the Void Palace first and not his father? Lionel couldn't help but think their brains were waterlogged. There were only 2 explanations that could possibly make sense to explain all of this. The first was that these people had no ability to gauge the value of this zone and what was inside of it. If they could, Lionel didn't believe they would use it so foolishly. The second was that Lionel was completely incorrect about all of this and this place wasn't a variant zone at all. The first made no sense. How could a power capable of targeting the Void Palace not do something as simple as scan a zone? Even if Lionel gave them the benefit of the doubt, the two things that were absolutely easy to do regardless of the level of a zone was to tell the quota limit, as in how many people could enter, and to tell what type of zone it was. The moment a zone actually manifested on the readings as a variant zone, even if it was a ninth-dimensional zone, especially if it was a ninth-dimensional zone, no one would use it for such a foolish thing. There was, of course, one other possibility that Lionel was somewhat ignoring. In order to use this zone to target the Void Palace, whoever sent it had to expand the size of the zone a tremendous amount. There was a chance that only a zone of a certain caliber could withstand this process. As such, whoever did this had no choice. But even if that was the case, Lionel didn't believe that they'd be so stupid. If Lionel was in their shoes, and he had such a method, but it could only work on an incredibly valuable zone, he would directly scrap such a method and throw it in the trash. In fact, he might, accidentally, allow his enemies to learn of it and hope they'd be stupid enough to do such a thing should they run into such a valuable zone. At least that way, they would waste it instead of growing more powerful behind his back. All of this logic applied as well if this was really a mythological zone. It had to be remembered that mythological zones were the most likely to become unique zones purely because of their value. When things were framed like this, it didn't make any sense whatsoever for this place to be a zone unless the enemies of the Void Palace were complete idiots. Just when Lionel had this thought, he shot up from Aina's embrace, his heart trembling. What if he was wrong about all of this? What if the enemies of the Void Palace knew very well of the value of this zone but didn't care? And what if they didn't care because they already had such methods at their fingertips? Chapter 1627. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 50 seconds AM. Chapter 1627. Between the world and you. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The current Lionel looked quite frightening. Blood fell from his eyes, ears and nose, and his heart beat so wildly that it only made the blood pour down faster. If Aina didn't know better, she would have thought that Lionel would bleed out right here and now. Lionel? Lionel. Aina directly shook Lionel, her features marred with worry. Lionel blinked, shaking his head and wiping the blood on his cheeks away. Eventually, a sigh came out from his lips. What is it? Are you okay? I don't know, I just thought of a frightening possibility. What? It's just that what's the best way to manipulate a zone? Aina blinked. You mean? If someone used a method like the Valiant Pillars and you took control of a zone, you could enter it as you pleased and farm whatever you needed from it. You can technically do this with any zone, it's just that it's only beneficial, usually, to do it with zones that contain a great amount of resources that can quickly recover in a small period of time. This world here is so large and vast. Even if we spent 100 years, I doubt we could learn everything that needs to be learned. But what if others had that time and then some? I'm saying that if this zone was originally a mythological zone or even a variant zone, and then it was taken control of by a special power, then this special power took their time to squeeze out every pinch of benefit they could get from this place. What if after they were done this zone also conveniently happened to be just strong enough to expand to hundreds of thousands of miles in diameter and swallow up one of your enemies with hardly any effort on your part? When Lionel said these things, Aina's heart trembled as well, coming to an understanding. There was a potential chance that all of Lionel's previous conjectures weren't wrong, but could rather only be correct if they were combined into one. Whether this was a variant or mythological zone didn't matter, they were just minor details. However, if it was only a zone of this caliber that could be used to swallow up the whole of the Void Palace, and one had already gotten everything you needed out of it, the question was, would it be worth it, then? The answer was, without a doubt, yes. And if yes was truly the answer, then the enemy that the Void Palace faced wasn't just a small measure more fearsome, they were leaps and bounds beyond anything the human domain could hope to fight against. Thela was a decent talent and her potential was high, especially considering her innate node. But she still wasn't considered to be anywhere near the best. Her 3 senior sisters teamed up and all of them together still couldn't be a match for whoever took first place in this Fiend class sector. And then it had to be remembered that this was still just the Fiend class sector, there were still numerous levels of the Chaos class geniuses to contend with after this. If this power could freely enter and exit this zone as they pleased, slowly teasing out its secrets and squeezing it dry of everything it had, before then no longer caring about it enough to the point that it used it in such a fashion, just what kind of strength did this power have now? Fearsome. Too fearsome. Lionel suddenly hesitated. How would this power react if he managed to reverse the situation and allowed everyone out? According to his calculations, once he succeeded, it wouldn't just be he and Aina who could leave this place. With the collapse of the barrier to this zone, all outsiders would be teleported away all at once, including everyone of the Void Palace who had been forcefully taken into this place. But now Lionel wondered if he should still do this. There was no doubt that if he delayed, many more of the Void Palace would die. In fact, many had likely died already. This place was a cruel world and he had learned of it firsthand. He already knew that once he stepped out of this event, even if Mistress Olidark left him be, the matriarch of the Endless Twilight Pavilion would not. The uncouth words he had spoken about her were one matter and that could probably still be overlooked depending on a few factors. But, Aina had killed 3 of her top disciples and had even taken the form of a chaos demon. Without Lionel here to block her from view, the elders above have definitely already seen this. If not for the fact they were in the demon world and not in the city any longer, they would have likely already swooped down to execute Aina. When Lionel thought to this point, he had an ugly expression. Was this really the only choice? The smart thing to do would be to sacrifice Aina. For the good of the human race and their survival, Lionel should allow everyone to stay in this world for as long as possible. Many would die, but those that survived would come out with the prowess capable of battling those that had imprisoned them in the first place. Lionel couldn't see another way. If these people realized that those of the Void Palace had returned and they really had such strength, they would just directly act to wipe out the Void Palace personally. He and Aina couldn't stay here forever. Eventually the event would come to an end and they would be forcefully teleported out. By then, the 2 of them would be faced with a sweeping host of powerful 7th-dimensional and maybe even 8th-dimensional individuals. Even if they gave him a path to survive thanks to his talent, Lionel wasn't naive enough to believe that they'd allow Aina to go freely. And he simply didn't have the strength to protect her. He couldn't even defeat a genius within his dimension. How would he climb above it to face those monsters? Lionel looked toward Aina. She had an intelligent glint in her eyes as she calmly looked back. She understood these things the moment Lionel spoke. Although she couldn't think as fast as Lionel, her intelligence had never been lacking. Aina smiled. Don't look at me like that, I was ranked ahead of you in Class A, remember? Who asked you to not take your studies seriously? Lionel was stunned for a moment before he laughed. He reached a hand forward, caressing Aina's cheek and pressing his forehead to hers. Aina trembled involuntarily, biting her lip out of habit. No matter how many times Lionel told her not to do that, she never could stop. Between the world and you, I choose you. Chapter 1628. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 49 seconds AM. Chapter 1628. An obvious answer. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel, Aina didn't know what to say. The transition into Chaos Demon wasn't something she could control. The moment she reached a certain stage of comprehension in her blood sovereignty and took out the heirloom of the Silver Empire, everything happened so fast she couldn't stop it even if she wanted to. It also didn't help that she didn't even know what kind of changes were occurring to begin with. Then, when it came to killing those 3 women, she was blinded by rage because the life and death of Lionel was unknown. And just by virtue of the state Lionel had returned in, their deaths were more than warranted. Still, even before then, it was already past the point of no return. She had thought that everything would be fine since Lionel had a method to leave this place and he wouldn't lie to her about such a thing. But now that she knew about this, she felt as though there was a lump in her throat that she couldn't quite deal with. She didn't want such a choice to be contingent on her. Just how many of the human domain would die because Lionel said such a thing? Lionel smiled, looking into Aina's eyes despite the closeness of their faces. Despite that smile and the twinkle in his eye, Aina knew the kind of weight Lionel felt on his shoulders making this decision. She knew how he felt about taking the lives of others and the kind of responsibility he felt toward protecting as many people as he could. He tried not to see any life as more valuable than another because even with his analytical mind, he couldn't find a logical progression toward the worth of a human life. But now, this very same Lionel was deciding that the life of one Aina was worth more than the life of countless others. Wasn't he just a hypocrite? Yes. Yes, he was. And quite frankly, right this moment, he didn't care. If it was his life, he wouldn't hesitate to put it on the line 100 out of 100 times. But when it came to the life of Aina, he would deign to play with it even once no matter how many opportunities he was given. Nothing would move him from this position. Didn't I say it already? I can do this impossible. Without me, everyone would be stuck here regardless. Since I'm the only one who can bring everyone out, this can be considered a small price for thanks. There's a limit to my selflessness and this is it. Lionel pulled his head back, standing to his feet. Right now, he almost felt angry, almost as though a voice in his head was telling him that he was being selfish. It made a fury boil in his heart. He didn't know where these feelings for Aina came from, but he knew that they were here and they weren't going anywhere. Aina would forever be his bottom line, his reverse scale. If it meant protecting her, if he was honest with himself, he didn't give a damn how many people died. You were angry about that? All right, then. Find a method to leave this place yourself. An arrogance far colder than usual exuded from Lionel, his irises dancing with a crimson hue. Let's go. Let's leave this place. Well, return to the human domain as soon as I finish this. Lionel exchanged for everything on his list, save a few things for little Tolly, before storing them all away. Then he began to bring out the items he had collected through the sectors one by one before pulling out his quasi-life grade force quill. He planned to finish all of these preparations in one go. Once he stepped out, it would only take a moment to fuse everything together and end it all. Lionel wasn't in the mood to continue shopping. He had everything he needed and he would make certain that whoever put them in here and made him make such a choice suffered. Although Lionel wasn't absolutely certain who it was, he was over 90% sure that it was the Three-Finger Cult. Only they could have such means. And, if it truly was them, then there was definitely someone within the Void Palace that worked together with them to execute such a large-scale plan. Lionel could bring everyone out, and in the future, he would make certain that they ever gave him such a chance. As Lionel worked, his expression only became colder and colder, even the air became frigid despite the fact he hadn't released any water force. Lionel had thought for a long time about exactly how to exit this zone. In fact, he had spent months on the problem. Ultimately, the answer lay in the full name of a zone. It was a subdimensional. Meaning, it was a pocket of space separate from reality that, under normal circumstances, couldn't be breached. In the past, subdimensional zone had been described to Lionel as points in history that met the present, almost like time loops that formed small pockets of space that shared a similar history, but also a somewhat separate timeline. This was why when you failed a zone, you would live out your life until you died rather than the zone just directly collapsing. While to you it would seem as though a lifetime had passed upon failure, to those of the outside world, the zone would open up immediately, sending the next group that entered to the beginning of the time loop. This concept became even clearer in Lionel's mind after he learned that the opposite of spatial force was time force. The two were opposite sides of the same coin, both together, and yet very much separate. Then, how exactly could you exit a zone after all having missed the get-off point? Well, the answer was found in the same way such zones were formed in the first place, a point where history met the present. Or in other words, on the other side of the coin, a point where one space met another. Simply put, if Lionel wanted to exit, he needed to find a way to bring them back to the reset point. He couldn't do this with time force, but he could do it with spatial force. Essentially, he had to find a way to force this zone to touch the human domain once again. Once these two worlds connected, it would be like the zone opened up again, but this time in reverse, thus allowing everyone to exit. At least, this was the simplified version of his thoughts. This, though, still left the matter of how. How would he force such a connection to occur again? Lionel needed a catalyst, a bridge of sorts that could force these worlds to interact once again, and he had the perfect solution to this. What Lionel needed was a third world, a world that could force these two together once more, a world that had a strong connection to the human domain, but was also sturdy enough to survive a trip through space. And to that, Lionel had the perfect answer. In fact, this world had already survived such a trip before. In fact, it had survived such a trip many times before. It even had certain abilities capable of hiding the presence of people from the eyes of a zone. By now, the answer was obvious: the segmented cube. Chapter 1629. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 48 seconds AM. Chapter 1629. Pissed if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Aina had never seen Lionel so focused. A dense amount of auspicious air flooded his surroundings. It felt that if she wanted to, she would easily be able to enter an extremely deep state of meditation, one even deeper than the one that had allowed her to form her chaos demon body. Aina couldn't help but wonder why it was that Lionel didn't use it more often. Whether it was his state of focus or his strength, she felt like it was on a completely different level when he entered this state. Was he just not aware? Or was it about his disposition? Could he not enter it freely? She could tell that Lionel seemed to be pissed off about something, but it was odd because he didn't seem to be angry with her. If anything, she felt like they were even closer now, closer than they ever had been. What woman wouldn't swoon when their man said words like Lionel just had? Lionel always seemed to have a way to make her heart flutter, but this just felt especially potent even in comparison to his usual way with words. But his disposition shifted again on a dime. She just felt like the more she understood Lionel, the less she actually understood. From what she did know, though, there were probably only two possibilities. Either Lionel was pissed off that he was too weak and had to make such a decision in the first place, or he was enraged at the thought that people were threatening her life to begin with. Knowing this unreasonable man, it was probably a combination of both. Only someone with his level of arrogance would be truly pissed off about such things. The first was a culmination of frustration. Lionel was usually lazy, that much was true. He didn't put in as much effort as he should and he was easily bored by things. But at the same time, he was also someone who could easily pour in a ton of time so long as there was a goal ahead. If he had just been lazy recently and that was the root of his weakness, fine, he would be able to accept it. But the reality was that before being forced into this situation, he had spent every waking moment of the previous year honing his strength. He hadn't taken a single step out of that training room, and the moment he did take a step out, the Void Palace was suddenly thrust into an existential crisis. He, despite his usual disposition, had put in 10 months of effort. He had put in so much effort that he even fell asleep for an additional 2 months. And yet, even that still wasn't enough to match up to the geniuses of this zone. First he found himself captured by the Olidiarch family, then he was surrounded by enemies in this event city, and when he finally found a soothing happiness again with Aina by his side, he was nearly crushed in a battle with Thela before he was, quite literally, eaten alive by a demon. Now he faced the cherry on top and he could already see the coming struggle ahead. Even if he completed this perfectly in time for them to be teleported out, they'd likely face stiff problems as he completed the final step. Just thinking about it pissed him off. He was probably more than strong enough to shatter the barrier his father left behind in the segmented cube, but he still felt like he somehow hadn't improved at all. It was frustrating. It felt as though he was running in place while the peak ahead only got further away and taller. Maybe only Lionel would be truly frustrated by such a thing. A year? What was a year of effort compared to the amount of time these geniuses had put into their crafts? What about compared to the old monsters that were waiting to target his life? What good was a year in the face of dozens? What about hundreds? But then again, did Lionel even have such an option? How long ago had the metamorphosis of Earth descended? He hadn't grown up in this world, he was just thrust into it without aim or purpose. Although he felt like he had his own purpose now, he couldn't seem to ever focus on it like he wanted to. It was almost like his mind wasn't fully in his own control. Lionel's wrist flicked and the final force art was completed. He took off the finger guard that had been with him all this time and slotted it into the center of it all. This guard was none other than the home of the segmented cube. Very soon, it would be complete again. Lionel looked up, the intent in his eyes blazing. The world wasn't fair, it wasn't designed to be. No one would care how long he had been in the dimensional verse for, no one would care that he had spent most of his childhood recovering for a grievous injury or that he hadn't gotten the chance to grow step by step with his greatest talent, his innate node, and had to instead watch as it became a ticking time bomb in his body. Since no one would care, he wouldn't care either. Lionel swept his completed craft into his spatial ring and stood to wrap an arm around Ana's waist. He didn't look toward her. Instead, his gaze practically bore a hole into the Emperor's might tablet. He felt a formless pressure boring down on him, pressing down against his soul. What Lionel had learned when his body separated from his soul was that while the root of most of his lineage factors were in his body, his king's might lineage factor actually called his soul home. In addition, when his body separated from his soul, the influence his innate node had on his king's might lineage factor was also stripped away, allowing it to regain its former clarity. Staring at it, Lionel felt a sudden compulsion. "Come here." His voice was cold to the point that Ana felt a tingle up her spine, her cheeks flushing red. An oppressive king's might surged into the surroundings, suffocating the surroundings in a dense purple fog that permeated even the protective formations. Lionel stretched out a hand and the bindings around the golden tablet shattered and it surged into his palm. Boom! 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 The world and the surroundings suddenly began to collapse. The other tablets vanished even as the Emperor's might tablet became illusory and shot into Lionel's body. Lionel's vision swam, and when he appeared once more, he was already standing outside of the city gates. At that moment, the skies above collapsed, a large surge of powerful elders of the seventh dimension rushing downward. Lionel didn't even look upward. His hand waved and a thick platform descended. Boom! The earth quaked and a strong surge of spatial force surged through the air. Many of the youths near Lionel and Ana were forced into a quick retreat. The platform embedded and hooked itself into the earth, becoming so solid that even Lionel, its creator, wouldn't be able to move it even if he wanted to. Chapter 1630. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 47 seconds AM. Chapter 1630. Superimposed. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The solid slab of silver metals that was at least 10 by 10 meters. Its edges were filled with complex runes that could make one's mind spin just looking at them, and its center was filled with a circular formation that seemed to rotate with life of its own. Halt. Hand the demon over. The elders above released mighty auras, soaring down upon their treasures. When Lionel heard this, his gaze flashed with rage, but he still didn't look upward. If he had the strength, he would have directly killed the person who said such a thing. However, even though he didn't look upward, his aura continued to grow like a towering tempest. Billowing violet fog in a wild crimson spread out further and further. From the perspective of the elders of this world, they had to capture Ana, and even if they couldn't capture her, they had to at least kill her. A demon that could camouflage themselves as a human was a crisis-level threat to them all. They had to know how it worked, and more importantly, how to counter it. The one good thing about demons was that they were easily spotted. But if one could hide so perfectly and even infiltrate their society to this extent, wouldn't it only be a matter of time before they were all finished? They couldn't allow Ana to escape no matter what. Violent surges of aura descended from the skies. If it wasn't for the fact they were caught off guard by the change, they would have already surrounded the city. But something Lionel did seem to have triggered the teleportation ahead of time, causing them to still be in the skies observing the situation until right this moment. Lionel. The roar of Mistress Olidark was among the loudest, and there was no doubt that this was on purpose. She should have been happy that Lionel had gathered so many points for her oligarch family, but truthfully, it was the direct opposite. She had to make it clear that she was going all out to kill Lionel and Aina, or else her family would be implicated. Who could have thought that the brat she had easily taken control of just might cause the downfall of her family so easily? She couldn't allow this to happen no matter what. Ripple. At that moment, a strong surge of force expanded outward in all directions. Bang! Several attacks from above suddenly found themselves blocked by a powerful barrier. This barrier wasn't actually part of the original design, but was rather just a subsidiary product of the function of the design. There needed to be an incredibly stable spatial link formed between this world and the next, so Lionel had modified the original design to need a powerful or with precisely these characteristics as the foundation. Lionel had done a lot of research about spatial rings and spatial force in general in order to create this method to retrieve the segmented cube. Now all of that research became the backbone for his method of returning home. He gave the segmented cube a landing mark, and that would be its original vessel to begin with. Now that the space was stabilized, seventh-dimensional individuals could forget about shaking it easily. Lionel had actually been prepared for eighth-dimensional experts to make a move, but there were none, surprisingly. What he didn't know was that they all had been pulled away by that sudden snap. But regardless, the fact that none were here, or disdained to act in Lionel's estimation, they could forget about stopping him. The space only grew more and more stable with each passing moment. Even for Lionel and Aina, who were in the center of it all, it was difficult even to move properly, let alone for these elders to shatter the barrier. Lionel slowly inclined his head almost as though he wanted to imprint the faces of all those above him. He even took an exceptionally long look at Mistress Olidark. He would never meet these people again, and he knew that, but for some reason he still did this. Maybe it was less about getting revenge later, and more of a reminder of what forced him into this situation in the first place. At that moment, the skies above split and a surging beam of light descended. Bang! It collided with the spatial barrier, and right then, it was as though the earth had been connected to the skies. The blue skies and clouds vanished, replaced by a vastness of darkness and sparkling stars. For a moment, some believed that someone had activated their natural light domain, but that was far from the case. Lionel's gaze flickered. This was part of his calculations, so he wasn't surprised about the pillar of spatial force. However, that shouldn't be what the skies looked like. It felt like... Lionel didn't get a chance to finish his thoughts when an amoeb-like bundle of energy suddenly shuttled through the pillar of spatial force. His eyes lit up. He knew exactly what that was. It was most definitely the world of the segmented cube. Seeing this, nothing else mattered. He knew that it had worked. Bang! The bundle of energy collided with the finger guard, and Lionel immediately stretched out a hand, causing it to shoot back toward him. The platform rumbled, a residual bit of energy that had coated the segmented cube's world fusing with it. The energy ran through the circular formation like it was rushing through a racetrack before it began to cause the runes near the edges to light up as well. At that moment, the entire world began to tremble. No matter where they were, the youths and elders of the Void Palace looked up. Some were hidden within organizations, others were running through the demon worlds, others were stuck in jail cells, and yet some others were being humiliated as slaves. However, not a single one of them didn't feel the tug. A sudden pulling sensation pulled them through as the two worlds superimposed. When the world finally calmed once more, every one of them had vanished. Chapter 1631. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 1631. Shitty old man, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel snapped awake to the sound of whistling wind, and not long after, to the feeling of his lips trying to touch his forehead. His eyes opened wide. Damn, were his calculations off? He had definitely set it so that he would land on his feet, so how had things happened like this? Why was he falling through the skies? Wasn't this a bit too cliché? Lionel's brows furrowed. There were too many things that were odd about this, but Lionel didn't have the luxury of thinking about it. He looked to his side to find that Aina had awoken as well. At the very least, they had managed to stay side by side, likely due to the fact he had been holding on to her. Lionel took hold of Aina, ready to do something to catch her. But at that moment, the feeling of strong armor in his palms suddenly became delicate and soft skin. His expression changed a bit, but he looked to the side to find that Aina had already entered her chaos demon form. Her armor separated from her body, becoming a dancing tornado of gorgeous black feathers, and her wings appeared once more. In an instant, their positions flipped and Aina caught Lionel, cradling him like a princess. Lionel found himself without the words to speak. He was certain that this mischievous little vixen had done this on purpose. Almost as though to confirm this, Aina couldn't even hit the ground before she started laughing. The sonorous sounds of her laughter spread over the surroundings. She couldn't help herself. Aina landed on the ground, still holding Lionel up with a wide smile on her face. She leaned down and gave him a peck on the cheek, her grin enormous. Lionel eventually laughed as well, even forgetting to check their surroundings. "You're not going to get down, princess?" Aina asked. "Why would I? I think this is actually pretty comfortable. Carry me around some more." Bang! Lionel fell to the ground and could only look up with a wronged expression. There was really no justice in this world. Lionel stood, patting his butt and looking around. This should be the void battlefield? How far out are we? The void battlefield was a large place, and the only region Lionel was familiar with was the Rapax region, and even that was just to a limited extent. Unfortunately, there was far more than just the Rapax here. From Lionel's understanding, pretty much every race of the dimensional verse had a land they controlled here. After all, this region could be considered the dividing lines between their territories, so how could they not protect what was effectively the front line? There was another reason for this as well, of course, and that was that the human domain would soon produce an eighth dimensional world. Once this happened, the layer of protection they had due to their relative weakness would be gone, and the ultimate result would likely be war. "Forget it, we can deal with this later. How about we go visit Blackstar? Maybe that annoying old man will have a way to tell exactly where we've gone and how to get back." Lionel somewhat sighed a breath of relief when he thought this. Wise Star Order was definitely an annoying old man, but so long as he was being annoying, this also meant that he was giving him knowledge that he didn't have. Aina nodded in agreement, somewhat missing the little mink as well. Lionel opened his palm, and the segmented cube, for the first time in over a year, finally changed its form once again and took the shape of a cube formed of jigsaws. With a smile, he grabbed Aina's hand and entered. But what he saw when he went inside left him somewhat floored. The segmented cube had been vast before, but now it was on a completely different level. Lionel landed in a vast forest with trees as tall as several hundred meters and so thick it would take dozens of men to wrap around it from tip to tip. What the hell? This place. It should be the garden of my residence, at least that's where I wanted to teleport to. How had things happened like this? Who? A booming voice descended from the skies and a familiar spirit appeared about Lionel and Aina. The old man had once again entered that ridiculously handsome form of his. He looked more like he should be walking runways and starring in movies than yelling so imposingly. Brat? Wise Star Order seemed just as taken aback to see Lionel as Lionel was to see the segmented cube. Lionel blinked, his head tilting to the side. Something about Wise Star Order seemed off. With how vast this world was, the only one who should have been able to teleport around so fast was Lionel himself, who was the owner of the cube to begin with. But somehow, Wise Star Order had just appeared here. Lionel's eyes couldn't help but narrow. At the same time, Wise Star Order's surprise turned into a malevolent grin. He finally had this brat right where he wanted him. Lionel reacted faster than Wise Star Order, using the pendant that his mother had given him to control the old bastard. But to Lionel's shock, Wise Star Order seemed completely unaffected. "Huh, you little shit. I've been waiting for this day for too long." Lionel and Aina's expressions both became dark at the exact same time. This old man had always been looking for opportunities to kill Lionel, but to think that he still wouldn't have given up after all this time. Wise Star Order's presence soared, but Lionel only grinned as the old man's spirit shot toward his head. Bang! Wise Star Order was sent spiraling away. When he stabilized himself, he could only look toward Lionel with an incredulous expression. You shitty old man, my dream force comprehension has already reached the pinnacle of the 7th dimension, and so have the barriers of my mind. Plus, my soul control is at a completely different level now. You can forget about it. Wise Star Order was speechless, not knowing what to say. Lionel shook his head. I leave you for a year and you already don't know how to act. Have some propriety as an elder. Wise Star Order's expression furrowed. A year? It's been decades. Chapter 1632. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 1632. The end of a phenomena? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's expression changed when he heard this. His mind spun into overdrive, trying to think of the possibilities for why this could be. His calculations seemed to have been off from the beginning since he was falling through the sky and even ended up lost somewhere inside the void battlefield. Could it be that this was the reason he was off? As specified previously, zones were technically points in time connecting with one another. Could it be that Lionel just connected with the wrong point? Considering the vastness of time itself, the fact that he had landed within a couple decades was already praiseworthy. It was so close that it couldn't even be considered a margin of error. After all, what was a couple decades in the face of trillions upon trillions of years? However, Lionel didn't feel like he was wrong. He had been so careful, so precise, it was simply impossible for such a thing to have happened. His confidence in himself was absolute. But everything seemed to point to the fact that he had, indeed, made a mistake somewhere. Lionel's brows furrowed further. By now, one might wonder why it is that Lionel didn't consider time dilation. After all, it was only a minority of zones that were one-to-one with real time and zone time. The vast majority had some sort of time dilation built in, even capable of halting the aging of the individuals who entered. But, while Lionel had heard of many zones that sped up time in comparison to the outside world, he had never heard of any that did the reverse. In fact, they didn't exist. This was something that Lionel could say confidently now that he had read all of the basic knowledge in the Void Library. Time dilation in the reverse was impossible, so the only explanation was that Lionel's calculations had been off. I made a mistake. Lionel's frown deepened to the point even his skin tone seemed to darken. Old man, have you ever heard of a zone time dilated in the reverse? Wise Star Order blinked but eventually shook his head. Such a thing didn't exist. Lionel shook his head as well. It seemed like things were truly impossible. There really was only one explanation, then. Forget it, what happened to my segmented cube? And why is it that you seemed so confident previously? Wise Star Order was about to answer, but at that moment, the shimmering appearance of an adorable little girl with a floating cloud for legs appeared. It's about time that you returned. Despite the commanding tone, one would only feel an overwhelming need to pinch this little girl's cheeks. I've seen you before. You were there after I left the dimensional cleanse, trial world. The little girl rolled her eyes. Don't remind me. Back then, I could have directly entered the 7th dimension, but I actually had to waste precious energy healing you instead. Can't you be a little less useless? Never mind, never mind. Since you brought me back to the 8th dimension now, I guess I shouldn't be too hard on you. Good boy. The little girl floated over and patted Lionel on the head. Lionel blinked. The segmented cube had entered phase 6. When? Had it been over the decades he had been gone? How, though? The segmented cube needed a ridiculous amount of energy to evolve. Even spending so long in a dense mass of what must have been ninth-dimensional vital star force wasn't enough for it to evolve to this level, but suddenly 2 decades was enough for it to reach this level? Something wasn't adding up. No. A lot of things weren't adding up. Don't think too hard. Your calculations weren't off, there are just certain things you're too weak about. Knowing would, quite literally, harm you. I don't mean in a figurative sense, I mean, as I said, literally. Lionel didn't know what to say to this. I am going to go and see little Blackstar and little Tolly. Lionel sighed. He had left them alone for too long. The phenomena is finished and spatial fluctuations have come to an end. They should have all returned now. An unknown voice spoke from the shadows. So my words were correct? Even if they were correct, we couldn't act on them until now anyway. I don't know how that brat did it, but he's even more troublesome than his father. Dealing with him will be as easy as flipping over a palm. His father has been on a rampage for the last 2 decades. His wife didn't appear until 11 years ago, and his son hasn't appeared until now. I told you that we should have acted when he was in the Void Palace. It wasn't worth the risk. There was a chance he could have stopped it. And what did that get you? The plan failed anyway because of his brat. The plan might have failed, but it wasn't for nothing. It's given us extra years to prepare. Now, we're already close. How do you want to deal with this matter, then? Using the Void Palace is too easy, we have too many methods. Just randomly choose one to get him kicked out of the Void Palace. By then, we can send any random agent and kill him off directly. Are we really ready to antagonize that man directly? We killed his father already, and what did he do? Pout a bit? He thought we killed his wife and son, and what did he do? Just pout some more. So what if we actually kill them this time? This is the luxury time has brought us. Although it's not advisable to fight him directly for now, we also have no need to fear him in the slightest. If he wanted to waste his time beating his head against a steel drum, let him. I really want to see what the piece of trash can do. He can just watch obediently as we kill off his family members one by one. Once a hard-headed fool, always a hard-headed fool. All right then, I have a method. It won't be too difficult at all. Get it done, but be patient about it. No need to activate any pieces, use the most natural and inconspicuous method. No issues on this side. Chapter 1633. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 44 seconds AM. Chapter 1633, Yip. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Yip. Yip. Lionel felt as though a boulder had slammed into his chest. He had barely stepped into the region when a familiar blur of black assaulted him. He fell to the ground, his face suffered an attack from a wet mass of pink. However, what should have been a soft tongue made Lionel feel as though layers of his face were coming off piece by piece. Lionel laughed. Little Blackstar had never licked him like this before. It seemed he had left the little guy alone for too long, only to come back and find that the little mink had become a dog instead. Lionel peeled Blackstar away from himself, holding the little mink up. He couldn't help but be surprised by what he saw. Little Blackstar had moved so fast previously that he hadn't gotten a good look, but the little mink had gone from fun-sized to massive. The Blackstar Lionel knew was barely over a foot long, but this Blackstar was easily 3 feet long and 3 times as thick as well. Though the not as little guy could still easily rest on his shoulders as usual, he was much larger than before. Lionel could even see a hint of maturity behind the little one's eyes, something that made him sigh. Little Blackstar was just a baby when Lionel met him, but now he was grown. Actually, if Lionel thought about it, little Blackstar was only about as old now as he himself was. Of course, it didn't make much sense to look at things like that. After all, the lifespan of third-dimensional minks versus third-dimensional humans was easily a 10 times difference. But luckily, little Blackstar was now well into the 6th dimension. In fact, it probably wouldn't be all that long before the little one entered the 7th. Lifespan at this level wasn't really much of a worry. In fact, for beasts, they tended to outlive humans because their bodies carried much more strength and vitality. Lionel grinned. He was honestly a bit worried. After 20 years, who knew what could have happened? Luckily, Blackstar still treated him just the same. Suddenly, little Blackstar vanished from Lionel's hands. Before Lionel could be confused, he heard some laughter coming from his back and realized that Blackstar had actually abandoned him in search of brighter, greener, and definitely much softer pastures. Lionel rose to his feet with a smile to see Blackstar snuggling with Aina. In truth, the relationship between the two had been quite estranged. During the matters of a year ago, Blackstar had obviously stayed with Lionel. It seemed, though, that the senses of his partner were quite sharp since he flipped a switch so easily. You didn't bully Blackstar, did you? Lionel looked toward Wise Star Order. Currently, the group was still within the large forest. It was so vast that Lionel still couldn't quite wrap his head around what he was seeing. But while it was vast, it was also quite empty. The segmented cube might have nearly become a sustainable world of its own, but it didn't have the ecosystem to match it. Even the trees and vegetation were very simple. They couldn't be considered to be high-class force herbs and were, at best, just some plants with longer lifespans and stronger bodies than normal. Bully? You should thank me. Whether it's the little mink, or those other 2 kiddos, I definitely treated them well. Lionel suddenly frowned. This was actually something that he was worried about. Wise Star Order couldn't harm him now, but that didn't mean Candle and Vice couldn't. Those 2 savants had been given 2 decades to grow. Just how powerful had they grown? Seeing Lionel's expression, Wise Star Order sneered as though he couldn't wait for something. But, the little girl, or rather, Anastasia, as she wanted Lionel to remember, didn't let him have his fun for long. Don't worry about this one, he's just blowing his own trumpet. He only helped because there was nothing better to do in this place. For someone who's lived so long, he completely lacks patience. All he's good at are little tricks, but he's too stupid to make them any good. Lionel rolled his lips over themselves when he heard this. It took everything he had not to burst out in laughter, but the amusement in his eyes was all too clear to Wise Star Order. To think that the mighty Wise Star Order would have such a day too. Wise Star Order glared at Lionel. Just because she looks like a little girl doesn't mean she is one. She's an old mon. Wise Star Order quickly cleared his throat, feeling a glare that could ruin him. The truth was that during the event that caused the segmented cube to dislodge from its original coordinates and separate from its vessel, Wise Star Order had almost died. As for the reasons why, they had little to do with the segmented cube itself and everything to do with that event. His life was going to be snuffed out, but Anastasia felt that he was more useful alive and actually tethered his existence to the segmented cube. That action actually led to the pendant that Lionel had becoming useless, and that was the reason why Lionel couldn't make any use of it. Unfortunately, this also meant that Anastasia had absolute control over him and his life and death was at the whims of this little girl. Knowing this, it was no wonder he was so obedient. But his hatred of Lionel had increased manifold. It was just too bad that he couldn't do anything about it. For some reason, though, neither Anastasia nor Wise Star Order seemed to have any intention of telling Lionel about these matters. So, when asked, what exactly happened that caused the segmented cube to separate from its vessel? I only woke up from a coma one day and you were all gone. Don't ask for the answers to questions you can't know the answers to. The harsh reality is that telling Lionel the truth wouldn't be too much of an issue, if he was a normal person. However, Lionel was simply too intelligent, even the most benign of clues might lead to a disaster. Anastasia wouldn't allow this to happen. Chapter 1634. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 43 seconds AM. Chapter 1634. Candle and Vice. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. I placed your metal spirit into suspended animation. 20 years of separation between yourself and your mink is one matter, but if you allowed the same to happen with your metal spirit, it would grow apart from you. Before maturity, spirits are too malleable and susceptible to their environment. If you only spent a fraction of their life with them, they would easily forget you, which makes sense since they live far longer than humans. Some even believe that spirits have no finite lifespans at all. The little one will be in the first lab. Anastasia changed the subject before Lionel could ask any questions quite clearly. It was obvious that she had no intention of allowing him to know the truth. The good news, though, was that Lionel was ecstatic to hear this news. He had actually been worrying about it. If little Tolly also entered the sixth dimension while he was gone, it would already be too late to do anything and he would have wasted billions of demon points on nothing. Someone else might have thought of abandoning little Tolly at that point and simply picking up a new metal spirit, but by this point, Tolliver was Lionel's partner. How could he abandon him just because? He wouldn't have the heart to do it. It wasn't long before Lionel felt that familiar feeling of little Tolly rushing through his fingers. He couldn't help but have a wide grin on his face. It seemed that suspended animation state hadn't affected the little one at all and it was just as enthusiastic. To it had been even less than a year since it had seen Lionel, but it was still far too long. Anastasia had obviously sensed this and made this decision herself. Toward this, Lionel could only be endlessly grateful. With a smile, Lionel turned to face Candle and Vice. The two of them didn't look to have aged a day, but this was to be expected. Although savants could rise through the dimensions via normal means, so long as their control over their ability index reached certain levels, they would have no problems living long lives. What did surprise Lionel, though, was that the usual shadow that loomed over them seemed to have dissipated somewhat. Candle's finicky and jittery demeanor was no longer as prominent and Vice seemed to have stopped copying everything Candle did to hide his true intentions. Most curiously, though, or maybe it was only to be expected since only the two of them were here, they seemed very close to one another. Facing Lionel now, they clearly found comfort in each other's presence. Lionel was happy that this happened. In fact, he had hoped that something like this would happen, although he had done nothing to try and force it. He wanted the two of them to slowly pull away from the shadow their life in Dark Cloud Prison had placed them under. Even if they didn't quite trust Lionel as he had simply vanished for 2 decades, it would still be easier to communicate with and understand them the more humanity they had. First, I want to apologize to you too. I had every intention of giving you both as much freedom as possible, but an event caused me to lose access to the segmented cube. To me, it's only been about a year and some change, but to you, it's already been 2 decades. There's already nothing I can do to fix that. However, I still that you two can. It's okay, Vice suddenly spoke. Lionel raised an internal eyebrow, but he didn't do much else other than smile when he heard this. In the past, Vice would be too busy imitating Candle to dare to interrupt Lionel when he was speaking because Candle would be too reserved to ever think of doing so. You don't need to treat them with kid gloves, Wise Star Order said with a snort. My 2 little disciples are stronger than you can even imagine. In that case, I'll ask you two something else then. What do you want to do in life? Lionel kept looking toward them, not sparing Wise Star Order a glance. The couple looked toward one another before grabbing a hold of one another's hands. We want to help Master rebuild the Luxnix family, Vice spoke for them both. Lionel blinked before chuckling inwardly. He knew that Wise Star Order would do his own bit of brainwashing, but it seemed that his claws were sunk deep into this pair. Lionel didn't dare to refute it either. After all, if his first interaction with Candle and Vice was to question their motives or if they were smart enough to make their own decisions, then it would completely ruin any goodwill he had in their hearts if there was any. To them, Wise Star Order was likely like a father by now, while he was just a person who had threatened them with death and then leveraged that into controlling their abilities. The gap was far too large. However, what happened next surprised him. It was actually Candle that spoke this time. We understand that Sir Lionel is also the hope of the Luxnix family, so we will do our best to assist you. Also, Vice and I want to thank Sir Lionel for not killing us for our abilities. We know that you could have any time you wanted, but you chose to spare us. Thank you very much. Candle spoke very softly, but her words were firm and carried much more confidence than Lionel expected. It seemed that she had truly come out of her shell as well. He had simply missed too much. Lionel sent a gaze toward Wise Star Order. He hadn't expected the old man to tell them about this. Of course, Lionel could have told them himself. But something like that was hard to bring up naturally without making it sound like a threat. If they didn't learn about it naturally, it was best they didn't learn about it at all. Wise Star Order snorted. "Don't look at me like that, this one made me tell them." Candle giggled hearing her master's complaints. The mood and atmosphere felt quite homey all of a sudden. Chapter 1635. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:17 and 42 seconds AM. Chapter 1635. Target: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. After these matters were settled and his heart was settled, Lionel couldn't help but think about the situation of the dimensional verse, and specifically, the human domain. If he had been gone for 20 years, too many things could have happened. Setting aside miscellaneous matters, he was most worried about Earth and his brothers. How had they been? And Earth, what dimension had it entered by now? Did it survive well without him there to battle on the front lines? What other powers were eyeing it? And if his brothers and friends were fighting those wars, had they survived? How were they faring? Lionel was itching to do something, but he forced himself to calm down. 20 years had passed already. A few seconds and even a few months wouldn't make a large difference. What had already happened and there was no changing it, and if they had managed to survive for 20 years, he was sure that they could manage to survive for a bit longer. Currently, he was in a severely weakened state. Never mind the fact that his dream force and mind hadn't quite fully recovered just yet, there was still the matter of his king's might being reset and the fact that his metal body had been undone and no longer had divine armors to support it. Much of Lionel's strength had been stripped down and it would be foolish of him to start rushing around without being able to consolidate what he had first. He had to take his time and first reach a bottleneck in his progression before he went out. He realized that every time he jumped into any sort of trouble, he never had any time to rest. There was no doubt that the human domain was in a large amount of turmoil right now with everything that had happened, so he couldn't afford to be casual with his life. "Anastasia, I plan to do a few things before leaving. Can you monitor the situation outside? I don't want the segmented cube to end up damaged because the wrong person ran into it." Anastasia nodded. "Oh, so you know how to be patient? It seems that someone finally taught you a lesson." Lionel coughed lightly. It seemed that he had traded one Wise Star Order for a sharp-tongued, albeit supremely adorable, Anastasia. Wise Star Order finally learned how to be obedient, but at what cost? "There's no need for you to worry. In Phase 6, the segmented cube's ability to shrink is even greater. No one would notice us under normal circumstances. It's good that you're deciding to take things slowly. There's nothing someone as pitifully weak as you can do anyway. Plus, you're the last to arrive anyway." Lionel frowned. Last to arrive? Anastasia's words seemed to imply that he and Aina were the last to find a method to return, but that didn't make any sense. Maybe it was because he was arrogant, but he was certain that even if everyone in the Void Palace was given a segmented cube to use as a catalyst to return home, he could probably count on his fingers how many would be able to think of the method. Could it be that there was another way to return? When you triggered the return sequence, you became the focal point of the return as you were the origin of everything. The point you stood upon was the very to make the connection, but it was also the last to disconnect. A sudden realization overtook Lionel. So he was the one that allowed others to return, but because he and Aina had been at the focal point, they were the last to return. When you were working with such long spans of time, what was ultimately a few microseconds worth of difference between when they left and when everyone else left, became dilated to decades worth on the side. How unlucky, this wasn't part of Lionel's calculations either. Even if he knew it would happen, he would still need to act. But it was still a bit unfortunate. Still, this is good. If the elders of the Void Palace returned well in advance, then it likely means that the turmoil in the human domain isn't so bad. They would have come back to stabilize the situation in time. Lionel felt that this was actually good news. You can look at it like that, or... Anastasia sneered. You can realize that this puts a huge target on your back. Lionel froze. He didn't need Anastasia to explain this to him at all. The moment she spoke the words, he hit him like a ton of bricks. Lionel couldn't see the core of the situation because he had been stuck in the thick of it, but from an outsider's perspective, especially given the sheer amount of time that had passed, it would have been easy to understand what was happening even if they didn't understand the methods Lionel had used. Ultimately, it would be very simple to conclude that whoever returned last once the phenomenon concluded should also be the person that had caused it all in the first place. Things would be fine under normal circumstances. After all, just statistically speaking, there would be others who came out in close proximity to Lionel. In addition, he and Aina had appeared in a completely barren location where none were here to observe their appearance. However, there were two methods of tracking Lionel. The first was his name in the Morales family Holy Land. It was less likely for there to be traitors in the Morales family, so this probably was as much of a worry. But this was where the second method came into play. The second was, of course, Lionel's badge as a Void Palace disciple. The moment he and Aina came back, others would know. Lionel didn't know much about the Void Palace in question, but what he did know was that his father had gone on a rampage in their territory, and this was even part of the reason he was a target of dissatisfaction for some factions. Obviously Lionel, given how much he respected his father, would never say that he was in the wrong, which very likely meant that the Void Palace had deserved it. In which case, the Void Palace had traitors amongst them, and those traitors would definitely know that he was the last to return. Lionel's gaze became frighteningly cold. It seemed that he would be targeted very soon. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.